Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. It was early in the morning when I found the key. I had woken up late, the sun barely peeking through the blinds. My head was still heavy with sleep as I shuffled toward the kitchen, making my usual routine of coffee. The apartment felt quiet, almost too quiet. I hadn't heard anything during the night, no footsteps in the hall, no strange noises, nothing out of place. But when I reached the door to the hallway, that's when I noticed it. The key was sticking out of the lock. I stood there for a moment, frozen, staring at the brass key with a feeling of disbelief settling into my gut. I knew, without a doubt, that I had locked the door before going to bed. The click of the lock was a distinct sound, one that I always double-check. I never leave my door unlocked. But there it was, a small, innocuous key, wedged into the lock as if someone had used it, turned it, and left it there without a care. I felt a cold shiver run through me, though I wasn't sure why. It could have been anything, some strange mix-up. Maybe I hadn't locked the door properly. Maybe I had been too tired to remember. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, I knew something wasn't right. I reached out slowly, hesitated, and pulled the key from the lock. The door was locked again, just as I had left it the night before. But the feeling of unease lingered. Had I really locked it? Had I imagined the click? I tried to shake off the discomfort, reminding myself that I was probably just overthinking things. But the more I stood there, the more the silence in the apartment seemed to press against me, growing thicker and more suffocating. I stepped back, glancing down the hallway toward the neighboring apartments. No one was in sight. No one had noticed anything strange. The usual hum of the building's life, the sound of neighbors moving about, distant voices, was gone. Everything was still. Too still. I turned back to the door and checked it once more. No one had come in. I had to convince myself of that, but it wasn't easy. The key still felt wrong in my hand, foreign and out of place. I locked the door again, double-checked it, and left my apartment, hoping to clear my mind with a walk. The fresh morning air was crisp, and the streets were quiet as usual, the world moving along as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something subtle and hidden beneath the surface. It followed me, whispering in the back of my mind, even as I tried to ignore it. And then, as I walked down the street, I saw it. A figure standing across the street, staring at me. I couldn't make out the details from this distance, but I could feel their eyes on me. It was as though the figure knew I was looking, and in that brief, fleeting moment, they turned and disappeared into the crowd. My heart skipped a beat. Was it the same person? Had I been followed? I pushed the thought aside, telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. There was no reason to think someone was after me. Nothing had happened. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, as though someone, was waiting for the right moment. When I returned home, I immediately checked the door again, half expecting to find the key still in the lock. But it was normal, locked, just as I had left it. But the unease hadn't gone away. It had only grown. That night, I locked the door once again before going to bed, taking extra care to hear the click of the lock, to feel the security of it. The apartment was quiet again, and I finally fell asleep, but I couldn't forget that feeling, the strange certainty that something wasn't right. It wasn't until the next morning that I realized just how wrong it all was. I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. A text message from a number I didn't recognize. It was a single word, "Look." I stared at the message, my heart starting to race. Who had sent this? Who knew I was here? I quickly checked the apartment, the door, everything was in order, but the sense of unease was suffocating now. My mind was on edge, and I couldn't shake the thought that someone, was very close, waiting for me to make the next move. And when I turned to leave for work, that's when I found it again. The key. It was back, this time in the lock when I approached the door. This time, I didn't hesitate. I took the key, my hands trembling, and turned it. But when I opened the door, there was nothing. No one. Just the empty hallway. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap. I wasn't sure if I could trust what I was feeling anymore, but one thing was clear, this wasn't over. The day felt off, like the world was out of sync. I kept thinking about the key. My mind kept drifting back to it, to that feeling I couldn't shake. Every time I looked at the door, it was as if something was hiding just beyond my reach, something I couldn't quite see but could sense in the pit of my stomach. I tried to act normal. I tried to push it out of my mind, to tell myself it was just some random occurrence, maybe the lock was faulty, maybe I'd forgotten something. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. By the time I got back home, the sun was setting, casting long shadows in the hallway. The apartment complex was quiet. Too quiet. The hum of the building felt distant, as if I were alone in a place that should be filled with life. I hesitated in front of my door, feeling the familiar weight of the key in my pocket. The sense of dread from earlier hadn't gone away. If anything, it had intensified. It wasn't just the key now. It was the silence, the emptiness of everything around me. I reached for the door, my hand trembling slightly. As I touched the handle, something in my gut twisted, as if I knew what I was going to find even before I turned the knob. The door opened without a sound. I stepped inside, heart pounding, and immediately scanned the apartment. Everything looked just as it had when I left, except for one thing. The key. It was lying on the kitchen counter. It hadn't been there before. I would have noticed it. I was sure of it. But now, it was there, sitting innocuously, as if it had always belonged there. I moved toward it slowly, almost unwilling to touch it. The key, my key, had been placed there with care. I picked it up, my fingers cold around the metal. The weight of it felt strangely familiar, like I had been holding it for years, even though I couldn't remember the last time I touched it. The feeling of being watched pressed against me again, stronger this time, like invisible eyes were boring into my back. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the apartment was empty. Nothing moved. The only sound was the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. I couldn't ignore the fear that had settled in my chest. Something about this felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I had to know who was behind this. But who would have the key? And why would they leave it for me to find? I stood there for what felt like hours, the key heavy in my palm. The longer I held it, the more I started to feel something. It wasn't just the weight, it was the sense of something familiar, like a memory on the edge of my mind. Suddenly, there was a sound. It was faint at first, a soft scraping noise from somewhere behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was like the sound of someone dragging their feet, but it was distant, too distant to be real. I spun around, heart hammering, but once again, I found nothing. The apartment was as still as before. I looked at the key again, feeling the strange compulsion to put it back in the lock. Without thinking, I walked toward the door and inserted the key, my hand shaking. The moment it clicked, I was hit with a sudden, overwhelming wave of dizziness. I staggered back, gripping the doorframe to steady myself. What was happening to me? I couldn't tell if I was losing my mind or if something truly was wrong here. The silence was suffocating, and the weight of the key felt like a burden I couldn't escape. I stepped back into the hallway, trying to collect myself. The sounds of the building had returned, distant voices, the faint buzz of the elevator, the murmur of the neighbors. But it all felt far away, as though I were disconnected from it, standing on the edge of something I didn't understand. Then, the door behind me creaked. It wasn't a loud noise. It was subtle, barely there, but unmistakable. I turned slowly, my body frozen in place. The door was slightly ajar. It hadn't been open when I left. I was sure of it. I approached it cautiously, heart pounding in my ears. My hand hovered over the handle as I opened the door wide, expecting to find something, someone, inside. But there was nothing. Just the quiet apartment, the stillness, the growing sense that something was terribly wrong. My reflection in the hallway mirror caught my eye. I looked tired, worn out, like I hadn't slept in days. My eyes were wide, my hair disheveled. And that's when I noticed it. In the reflection, behind me, standing just at the edge of the doorway, was a figure. A shadow, indistinct, but there. Watching. I whipped around, but no one was there. I stepped back, my mind racing, my breath quickening. This couldn't be happening. I had to be imagining things. The key, the noises, the shadow, it all had to be some kind of mistake. A trick of my mind, stressed and sleep deprived. But the key was still in my hand. I walked quickly through the apartment, checking every room, every corner, but I found nothing. It was the same. Empty. Quiet. Still. Except for one thing. The door was now locked again. I hadn't locked it. I hadn't even touched the key. But there it was, locked. And I realized then I wasn't alone. The realization hit me like a jolt of electricity. The door was locked again, and I hadn't touched the key. My mind raced, trying to grasp the impossibility of it all. How could this be happening? There had to be a logical explanation, right? A malfunction, some kind of mistake, but the feeling of dread clawing at me said otherwise. It was as if something unseen was controlling the situation, pulling the strings from the shadows. I stepped back from the door, my heart still pounding in my chest. The key lay heavy in my hand, and I found myself staring at it as though it held the answers to everything. My pulse quickened, and I could feel my hands trembling. I looked at the hallway again. The faint scraping sound I had heard earlier lingered in my mind, echoing through the silence. It was as if the entire building were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The air was thick, charged with an energy that felt wrong. I couldn't stay in the apartment. The oppressive stillness was overwhelming. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. There, in the corner of the living room, was something new. A small, crumpled piece of paper on the floor, half hidden behind the couch. My feet moved toward it before I could even think, as if I were being pulled by some invisible force. I crouched down and picked it up. The note was short, handwritten in a familiar scrawl. My breath caught as I read it. I see you. I stood frozen, staring at the note. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was mine. But that didn't make sense. I hadn't written this. I hadn't seen this note before. My thoughts swirled, panic rising like a tide. I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay another second in this place. But as I reached for the door handle, a strange pressure seemed to grip the air around me. It was as if the very space inside the apartment was closing in on me, tightening like a vice. The key, still in my hand, felt heavier than ever, the metal pressing into my palm like a reminder of something I couldn't escape. I looked back at the door, feeling the presence behind me, even though no one was there. "What's happening?" The words escaped my lips in a whisper, as though speaking them aloud would break the silence that seemed to surround me. But the silence didn't break. Instead, it thickened. A soft, rhythmic tapping came from the far end of the hall. It was subtle at first, a quiet sound, like fingernails against wood, but it quickly grew louder. Closer. With every tap, my heart skipped a beat. It was coming toward me. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the hallway. Nothing. But the tapping continued, getting closer until I could almost feel it on my skin. I stepped back, unsure of where to go, when suddenly everything stopped. The tapping ceased and the silence returned. I exhaled, relieved for a moment, but it was a fleeting sense of calm. Because that's when I saw it. In the reflection of the hallway mirror, just beside the door, a shadow moved. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. But no, there was something there. Something that didn't belong. Something that couldn't possibly be there. I spun around, my eyes wide with fear, but there was nothing. Only the empty hallway, the silent apartment, and the unmistakable weight of the key in my hand. It was happening again. The strange occurrences, the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond my understanding. I had to leave. But as I took a step toward the door, a sound stopped me dead in my tracks. A door creaked open, softly, from somewhere behind me. My blood ran cold. I turned, my heart racing, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure in the doorway. But it was gone before I could process it, fading into the air like a dream. I stood there, paralyzed, unsure of what to do. The door was wide open now, the hallway beyond stretching into darkness. The faintest hint of movement caught my eye. It was just a shadow, but it moved. It flickered at the edge of my vision. I couldn't ignore it any longer. With trembling hands, I turned the key in the lock and stepped back out into the hallway. The door slammed shut behind me with a force that made me jump. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My footsteps echoed down the empty corridor as I walked toward the stairs. The apartment was behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't left it completely. Something was with me. I could feel it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I made my way to the exit. My mind was racing, filled with questions. What was happening? Who had been in my apartment? And what did the key mean? I couldn't shake the sense that I was being drawn into something I didn't understand, something that had been set in motion long before I'd even noticed. The sound of the key turning in the lock echoed in my mind, and I knew, deep down, that I wasn't done yet. I hadn't escaped. I stood in the lobby, my breath shallow, the echo of the door slamming still ringing in my ears. The hallway stretched out before me, seemingly endless. I wanted to leave. I wanted to escape from whatever strange force had taken hold of me, but something kept me there, rooted to the spot. My eyes scanned the quiet lobby, the same walls, the same worn-out carpet that had been there since I moved in. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. A creeping sense of dread gnawed at the edges of my mind. I felt it in my chest, this pressure, this weight, pressing against my ribs, squeezing the air from my lungs. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening before it swallowed me whole. But no one in the lobby noticed anything unusual. The building was quiet. Too quiet. I glanced around, but all the faces were familiar, indifferent. The older woman by the mailboxes didn't look up from her knitting. A young couple whispered as they passed, holding hands. No one saw the tension in the air. No one felt the same cold hand at their throats that I did. It was as if I were the only one aware of the invisible force that had taken control of my life. I tried to calm myself, but my mind kept returning to that key. The key that had turned itself in the lock. The key that had been inserted in my door when I had locked it myself. There had to be an explanation. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I had been too tired, too distracted. But then, the note. I could still feel the cold weight of the paper in my hand, the sharpness of my own handwriting glaring back at me. I wasn't imagining that. I had never written that note. Yet, it felt like a message I had sent to myself. A warning, perhaps, or a sign that I was no longer in control. I moved toward the exit, trying to put distance between myself and the oppressive atmosphere in the building. I reached for the door, but before I could push it open, a sound stopped me dead in my tracks. A soft, steady tapping. It was the same sound I had heard earlier. It was coming from the stairwell, the one that led to the upper floors. I turned toward the sound, my heart hammering. There was no mistaking it now. Someone, or something, was up there. My first instinct was to run. To leave the building entirely and never return. But something held me in place. A strange curiosity mixed with fear, urging me to move closer, to investigate. I stepped toward the stairs, the tapping growing louder with each passing second. My hand shook as I gripped the railing, the cold metal sending a jolt of unease through me. The sound was unmistakable now, a rhythmic, deliberate tapping, as though someone was waiting for me. I couldn't stop myself. I had to know what it was. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath my weight. The quiet of the building seemed to close in around me, the air thick and heavy. My breath was loud in my ears, and every shadow seemed to move with a life of its own. The tapping continued, unwavering, as I reached the top floor. The hallway was eerily still, the lights flickering above me like a dim warning. I reached for the door to the upper level, but as soon as I touched the handle, the sound stopped. I froze. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The kind of silence that wraps around you, suffocating you with its emptiness. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A shadow. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it was there. A figure, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, standing at the end of the hallway. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its presence. It was as though the very air had thickened around it, drawn toward it, feeding off its darkness. The figure didn't move. It stood completely still, watching. I took a step back, my breath quickening. It couldn't be real. It had to be my imagination. But as I took another step, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The shadow was moving. It was so subtle that I almost didn't notice at first, but there it was. The figure shifted, slowly, impossibly, as if it were drifting across the floor rather than walking. It was gliding toward me, its form becoming clearer with every inch it moved. I backed away, my legs trembling beneath me. My mind raced. I needed to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. The figure was so close now. I could see the faint outline of what looked like a coat, a long, dark coat that hung too low, too empty. There was no face. Only darkness. I wanted to scream, to turn and flee, but I was paralyzed. I couldn't look away. It was like the figure was pulling me in, drawing me closer with an invisible force. Then, just as it reached out for me, the figure vanished. Just gone. I blinked, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no sign of it. No shadow, no trace, no movement. The hallway was empty again. Silent. I stood there, my chest heaving, the sense of dread now overwhelming. The tapping had returned, but it was no longer coming from the stairwell. It was in the walls, in the very floor beneath my feet. "I'm not alone," I whispered. And I knew then that I never had been. Something, or someone, was watching me. Always watching. The key had been only the beginning. The real terror was still ahead. I couldn't move. I stood frozen in the hallway, my body gripped by a cold terror I couldn't shake. The silence had returned, but it wasn't comforting. It was suffocating, as if the air itself had become thick with the weight of what had just happened. The tapping had stopped. The shadow was gone. But I could feel the presence still lingering, like an invisible hand brushing against my skin. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything, but it was impossible. The key, the locked door, the note, the shadow, it all felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't complete. And the more I thought about it, the more terrifying it became. I backed away from the door, away from the stairs, my feet moving without my consent, as if my body was instinctively trying to escape. But there was no escape. Not anymore. I turned to leave, but as I did, I felt it again. That sensation of being watched. It was worse now, more intense, like a pair of eyes boring into my back. I whipped around, expecting to see something, but the hallway was still empty. There was nothing. Nothing except the key. The key that had started all of this. I reached into my pocket, my hand shaking as I pulled it out. It felt colder now, heavier, as if it had absorbed the fear in the air. I looked at it, trying to understand what it meant. The small, old-fashioned key with its simple design. The one I had found in my lock. It had to mean something. My fingers gripped it tightly, almost desperately, as if by holding it, I could somehow control what was happening. But the more I looked at it, the more I realized that the key wasn't just a key. It was a symbol. A symbol of something much darker, something I couldn't fully comprehend. I turned to the door again, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to know what was behind it. I had to know what this key was leading me to. Maybe if I opened the door, everything would make sense. Maybe the answer to all my questions would finally be clear. But as I approached the door, something changed. The air grew colder. The faint hum of the building, the sound of the old pipes creaking and groaning, was replaced by an oppressive stillness. The walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows stretching longer, darker. It was as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. I reached for the doorknob, but my hand froze just before I could turn it. Something was wrong. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that the key wasn't the only thing in my hand anymore. There was another object. A piece of paper. Folded, crumpled, and cold to the touch. My breath caught in my throat as I unfolded it, my hands trembling. The writing on the paper was the same as before, the same as the note I had found earlier. The same handwriting. It read, "You shouldn't have come back. The key was never meant for you." I staggered back, the key falling from my hand and hitting the floor with a soft thud. The words burned into my mind, their meaning twisting in my gut. The key was never meant for me. Then it hit me. The key wasn't just unlocking a door. It was unlocking something else. Something darker. Something that had been waiting for me all along. I turned and ran, my mind a blur of panic and confusion. I had to leave. I had to get out of this place before whatever was waiting behind that door found me. But as I reached the stairs, I saw something that froze me in my tracks. The shadow. It was there again, standing at the bottom of the stairwell, its long, dark form stretching toward me. The same figure from before, only this time it wasn't still. It was moving, slowly, deliberately, as if it were drawn to me. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no way out. The hallways were endless, the building a maze, and the figure was closing in. I had nowhere to hide. I glanced at the door, my pulse racing. I had to go through it. I had to face whatever was on the other side. But as I turned back toward the figure, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't alone. There were more. Shadows, all around me, stretching from the walls, from the floor, from the corners. Each one moving toward me, their shapes becoming clearer, more distinct. They were all tall, dark figures, their faces hidden in the darkness, their presence suffocating. I couldn't breathe. I stumbled backward, my mind racing for a way out, but there was nothing. No escape. The figure in front of me took a step forward. Then another. And then, with a sudden, terrifying clarity, it spoke. "You opened the door," it whispered, its voice a cold, hollow echo in the silence. "And now you belong to us." I turned to run, but it was too late. The shadows closed in, surrounding me, engulfing me in their cold embrace. And I knew, in that moment, that there was no escaping. No way out. The key had always been the beginning. And now, it had claimed me. Have you ever received a gift from someone you didn't know? A gift that seemed to appear out of nowhere, with no return address, no signature, no trace of who it came from. What if that gift wasn't just a surprise, but a warning? It was an ordinary Monday morning when I first noticed it. I walked into the office, still tired from the weekend, and headed straight to my desk. The usual clatter of keyboards, quiet murmur of conversations, and the sound of coffee cups being placed on desks filled the air. But something was different. Something was off. On my desk, nestled between the stack of paperwork and my half-empty coffee mug, was a small, neatly wrapped gift. It wasn't huge, about the size of a shoebox, but its presence was impossible to ignore. The wrapping was simple, with plain brown paper and a thin, black ribbon. It wasn't extravagant or special in any way, yet the starkness of it stood out against the clutter of my desk. I blinked in confusion. I hadn't ordered anything. I hadn't been expecting any deliveries. I looked around the office, half expecting to see someone laughing, waiting to see my reaction. But everyone seemed busy with their own work, not even glancing in my direction. I picked up the gift, feeling its weight in my hands. There was no card. No label. Just the faintest hint of something cold beneath the paper, something metallic, perhaps. As I turned the package over in my hands, I noticed the small piece of paper that had slipped out from underneath the ribbon. I unfolded it slowly, almost cautiously. The handwriting was neat, but unfamiliar. "Thank you for everything." That was it. No name. No other details. Just those words, hanging in the air like a strange echo. I glanced around the office again, hoping for some kind of explanation, but no one seemed to have noticed anything unusual. I felt a slight unease stir in my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I stood there for a moment, holding the gift and the note, unsure of what to do. My fingers trembled slightly as I set the gift back on the desk. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe someone had left it as a prank. But who? And why? I shrugged it off. It was probably just a misunderstanding. I didn't have time to dwell on it. I had work to do, and the gift was likely a harmless gesture. But the feeling of unease didn't leave. It only deepened. As I sat down at my desk, I couldn't help but glance at the gift again. The words on the note lingered in my mind. Thank you for everything. What did it mean? Was it from a friend? A colleague? Someone I didn't even know? The thought of it made me uneasy, but I forced myself to focus on my work. Yet, the more I tried to concentrate, the more the gift seemed to stare at me, drawing my attention back to it, like it was waiting for me to acknowledge it. And then, as I went about my tasks, I started to notice something strange. The office had grown quieter. People were still typing, talking, moving around, but there was an odd stillness in the air. The hum of the fluorescent lights above me seemed louder, somehow, almost deafening in the silence. I could hear every footstep, every cough, every faint rustle of paper. And then it happened. A sound. A faint rustling, coming from the direction of the gift. I froze. It wasn't a movement I had made. It wasn't the wind. The noise was subtle, but distinct. Almost like someone was tugging at the wrapping, trying to open it. I glanced around, but no one seemed to be paying attention. My heart began to race. I slowly turned my head toward the gift again. It was still there, untouched. But the feeling of something watching me, waiting, crept over me. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things or if the gift truly had changed in some way. The silence around me deepened, and the air felt heavier. I leaned forward, reaching for the gift once more, but my hand stopped halfway. Something was off about the way it sat there, as if it were shifting. As if it were alive in some small, unsettling way. I pulled my hand back quickly, my fingers twitching in hesitation. I felt the wave of eyes on me, though no one was watching. It was as if the gift had some power over the space, and I was becoming its unwilling subject. I glanced at my colleagues. No one seemed to notice anything strange, but their faces seemed distant. Hollow, even. No one met my gaze. No one seemed concerned about the odd presence sitting on my desk. I began to feel like I was the only one who could sense that something wasn't right. That's when I noticed the shadow. A faint shadow, growing longer, stretching across the floor towards me. At first, I thought it was just the way the light hit the desk. But then, it wasn't the light. It was something else. A figure. A shape, dark and twisted, barely perceptible, standing just behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing there. Yet, the feeling remained. The gift, the shadow, the silence, it all felt connected, but I couldn't understand how. The shadows seemed to follow me, lurking just at the edge of my vision, never quite close enough to see clearly. It was as if something unseen had attached itself to me, and no matter how hard I tried to shake it, it stayed, always present, like a heavy fog hanging over my mind. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong. Something was deeply wrong. But I didn't know what to do. And that, more than anything, was what terrified me the most. I tried to push the thought of the shadow out of my mind, but it clung to me like a persistent whisper I couldn't escape. Every time I looked away, I could feel it lurking at the edges of my vision, just out of sight. I couldn't explain it. I didn't know what it meant. But I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't ignore it. I forced myself to focus on my work. I had to. I had deadlines to meet, emails to send, reports to finish. But the more I tried to concentrate, the more the unease gnawed at me. The air in the office felt thicker, heavier. The usual hum of the office machines seemed far away, replaced by a low, unsettling silence. The gift sat there on my desk, still unopened. Every so often, I glanced at it, half expecting it to move. But it never did. It was always there, waiting. I glanced around the office again. People were typing away, talking quietly on the phone, but something was off. They seemed distant, disconnected. Their voices were too low, their movements too stiff, like they were puppets, going through the motions but not fully alive. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it was impossible to ignore. I decided to take a break. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe the gift was nothing more than a harmless gesture from someone who appreciated my work. Maybe it was a coincidence that I hadn't seen who left it. But the nagging feeling wouldn't leave. I stood up from my desk and walked towards the break room. The office felt emptier than usual, the hallways quiet, the fluorescent lights flickering intermittently as I passed beneath them. As I reached for the door to the break room, I heard a noise behind me. A faint creak, like a floorboard groaning under the weight of someone walking. I turned quickly, heart racing, but there was no one there. I frowned. The building was old, but I had never heard noises like that before. It sounded wrong. Too deliberate. As though someone, or something, was following me. I shook the thought out of my head. It was probably just the building settling. The creak of old wood. Nothing more. I entered the break room and poured myself a cup of coffee. The warm liquid did little to ease the chill that had settled in my bones. I leaned against the counter, staring out the window at the gray sky. The clouds were thick, swirling, as if the weather itself was mirroring the storm brewing inside me. As I sipped my coffee, I thought back to the gift. Thank you for everything. Those words repeated in my mind over and over again, like a chant. Who was it from? Who knew me well enough to leave such a personal message? And why had they left it in such an unsettling manner? My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the office phone ringing. I set my coffee cup down and walked back to my desk. The gift was still there, undisturbed. I picked up the receiver, feeling a sense of dread crawl up my spine. Hello? I said, my voice coming out shaky. There was a long pause on the other end, so long that I almost thought the call had dropped. Then, a voice, soft and distant, came through. Did you like the gift? My breath caught in my throat. I froze, clutching the phone tightly, my heart pounding in my chest. Who is this? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but it cracked on the last word. There was no answer at first, just the faint sound of someone breathing, slow and deliberate. Then, the voice spoke again, this time much quieter, almost a whisper. Did you find the message? Thank you for everything. The line went dead. I stared at the receiver in disbelief. My pulse raced, my mind reeling. I had no idea who it was. No clue who had called or how they knew about the gift. The voice had been calm, almost too calm, like someone who already knew everything. The words echoed in my mind, the same words from the note. I stood there for a moment, the phone still pressed to my ear, as if expecting the voice to return. But it didn't. Slowly, I placed the phone down on its cradle and turned back to the gift. It sat there, innocently, as though nothing had happened. The ribbon was slightly askew, as if it had been touched, but that was it. I reached for it again, my fingers trembling as I untied the ribbon. The paper came away easily, revealing the small box inside. I hesitated before opening it. My mind screamed at me to leave it alone, to walk away, but I couldn't. Something was compelling me to look, to understand. With a deep breath, I opened the box. Inside was a small, silver key. I picked it up, feeling its cool weight in my palm. It was plain, unremarkable, but the metal was smooth, polished to a shine. The key had no tag, no engraving, nothing to indicate what it was for. But it felt important. It felt like it held a secret. I turned the key over in my hand, my thoughts racing. Where had it come from? What was it for? And why was it left for me? I heard another noise behind me. This time it was unmistakable, footsteps, heavy and slow, coming closer. My heart skipped a beat as I turned to face the sound, but the office was still empty. There was no one there. But the feeling of being watched, of being followed, was stronger than ever. The key in my hand felt colder now, as if it were drawing the warmth from my skin. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening, whatever force was behind the gift and the phone call, was only just beginning. And I wasn't sure I was ready to find out where it would lead. The key felt heavier now, a weight that pressed against my palm, making it feel like it was no longer just a piece of metal, but a connection to something I didn't understand. I closed my fist around it, my fingers trembling slightly. My mind was a whirlwind of questions, each one more confusing than the last. Who had left it? Why me? And what was it for? I glanced around the office once more, hoping to find some sort of explanation in the faces of my colleagues. But everyone seemed preoccupied, lost in their own worlds. The usual chatter was absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. Even the fluorescent lights above me hummed quietly, as if reluctant to draw attention to the growing tension in the room. I slipped the key into my pocket, hoping to forget about it for a while, but the nagging feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. It was as if the key was calling me, urging me to do something. I could feel its presence pressing against me, even though it was tucked away. It was as if it were alive, and I was being drawn into something I couldn't escape. I tried to focus on work, to push the disturbing thoughts out of my mind. But each time I glanced at the door to the office or heard a creak in the building, I found myself wondering, was someone watching me? Had the mysterious person who left the gift already been here, or were they still close, hidden in plain sight? As the day wore on, the atmosphere in the office grew more oppressive. It was as though the walls were closing in, each moment heavier than the last. The usual hum of office life, conversations, phones ringing, the tapping of keyboards had all but disappeared. Now, there were only the strange, unsettling silences that filled the space between every breath. At one point, I got up to go to the bathroom. I needed a moment to clear my head. The hallway was dimly lit, the overhead lights flickering occasionally. The building was old, but this seemed different. The flickering lights felt intentional, as if someone was trying to draw attention to something, to make me aware of it. I quickened my pace, eager to escape the growing tension in the office. When I returned, The gift was still on my desk. But something had changed. The ribbon, which had been loosely tied when I first opened the box, was now neatly secured, as if someone had tied it again. The note was gone. My heart skipped a beat. How could that be? I had seen the note earlier. I was sure of it. I reached for the box again, my hands now cold with anxiety. The key was still there, just as I had left it. But without the note, without the words "thank you for everything," the key seemed even more mysterious, even more unsettling. I looked around the office. No one seemed to notice anything out of the ordinary. They were all going about their work, as though the strange events of the day were nothing but figments of my imagination. But I knew better. Something was happening, something that I couldn't ignore. I needed answers. Without thinking, I stood up and grabbed my coat. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay here any longer. I needed to get out. To think. I left the building and stepped into the cold air. The city was bustling as usual, people rushing past, cars honking, and the distant sound of construction filling the air. But the noise felt distant now. It was like I was in a world that was spinning faster than I could keep up with. Every sound, every movement seemed like it was happening just beyond my reach. I walked for a while, my mind spinning with questions. What was the key for? Why had it been left for me? And why did it feel like something, or someone, was tracking my every move? I found myself at a small park, the trees bare and the ground covered with dead leaves. It was quiet here, and I needed that silence. I sat down on a bench, pulling the key from my pocket and examining it again. It was still cold, its smooth surface reflecting the pale light of the afternoon. Suddenly, I felt a shiver run down my spine. There was someone behind me. I could feel it. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a whisper. But I could feel their presence, like a weight pressing against the back of my neck. I glanced over my shoulder, but no one was there. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, to escape, but something held me in place, like an invisible force had wrapped itself around me. The key felt colder in my hand, as though it was absorbing the fear that was rising in my chest. I stood up quickly, the feeling of being watched intensifying. I needed to leave, but where could I go? What was happening? As I turned to leave the park, I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. A figure standing at the far end of the path. They were facing away from me, just standing there, perfectly still. I couldn't see their face, but I knew they were watching me. I could feel it. I didn't stop. I didn't want to know who it was or why they were there. I walked faster, my heart racing, until I reached the street and the noise of the city drowned out everything else. But even as I walked away, the feeling of being followed didn't stop. It only grew stronger. When I returned to my apartment that evening, I immediately checked the door. The key was still in my pocket, but it didn't feel like my key anymore. It felt like it belonged to someone else. Something else. I inserted the key into the lock, feeling a strange sense of dread wash over me as the door clicked open. The apartment was just as I had left it, yet something was different. The air felt heavier, thick with the presence of something unseen. And then, I heard it, the faintest sound of footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, but no one was there. The door was still open, but I didn't dare step inside. Something was waiting for me, something that I hadn't invited in, but was now a part of my life. Something I couldn't escape. The key, cold in my hand, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. And I realized, with growing horror, that I wasn't the one who was in control anymore. The key felt as if it had turned from metal to ice, chilling my entire body, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't fully understand. Standing in the doorway, I felt frozen in place, caught between the need to retreat and the compulsion to move forward, to confront whatever had brought me here. I glanced around, half expecting someone, to emerge from the shadows. But the apartment was still, eerily quiet, as though the very air held its breath. The door, wide open now, seemed to beckon me inside, but the terror gnawing at the edges of my thoughts held me back. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, to run, to forget about the key, the gift, and everything that had happened. But I couldn't. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, my foot barely making a sound as it touched the floor. The apartment seemed unchanged, but the stillness felt off. Like everything was too perfect, too quiet. A strange sense of déjà vu washed over me, as if I had walked into this very room before, only to find it changed beyond recognition. I closed the door behind me with a soft click, the sound louder than it should have been, echoing in the hollow space. I glanced back at the key still in my hand, wondering if it was truly the source of my fear, or merely a reminder of the strange, invisible force that seemed to be pulling me deeper into whatever was happening. I set the key on the kitchen counter, my eyes lingering on it for a moment before I turned away. My mind was too scattered to think clearly. I needed to clear my head, to rationalize what had been happening, but every attempt to do so felt futile. The idea that something, or someone, was controlling my every move, that my life had somehow been taken over by unseen forces, made me feel helpless. As if I was merely a puppet, my strings pulled by an entity I couldn't see. The apartment, my apartment, suddenly felt far too large, as if it had expanded in size to accommodate something I wasn't supposed to be a part of. I reached for the light switch, but my hand froze just above it. There was a noise, a soft scraping sound, coming from somewhere in the apartment. I stood still, holding my breath, listening for any further indication of what it could be. I walked carefully into the living room, my every step hesitant. I checked the windows, the locks on every door, anything that could offer me an explanation for the unnerving feeling settling in my chest. But nothing seemed amiss. The apartment was empty, there was no one there, nothing had changed. Still, the atmosphere had thickened, pressing down on me, suffocating me with its weight. Then I heard it again. The scraping sound. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but again, nothing. The air was still. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I knew I wasn't alone. I wasn't crazy, there was something here. I just couldn't explain what it was. I rushed to the door, the key suddenly feeling unbearable in my pocket. I needed to leave, to escape this overwhelming presence. But just as my fingers touched the doorknob, something made me stop. The faintest whisper, like a breath on the back of my neck, reached my ears. "You're not going anywhere." The voice was low, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. I turned slowly, my body trembling with dread. There, standing in the dim light of the hallway, was a figure. A shadow, a silhouette of a person, but with no distinct features, no face. Just a presence. I couldn't see them clearly, but I could feel their gaze on me, even though I couldn't say where exactly they were. I stepped back, my breath shallow. Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it moved, gliding across the floor, unnervingly smooth, as though it wasn't entirely human. I took another step back, my legs trembling, my mind racing for an explanation. I turned toward the window, hoping to make a run for it, but before I could take another step, the figure was in front of me, blocking the exit. It had moved so quickly, I hadn't seen it coming. My heart raced in my chest, my pulse pounding in my ears. My head spun, unable to comprehend what was happening. The figure was silent, but I could feel the presence pressing closer, suffocating. The air grew thicker with each passing moment, and I realized I was not in control anymore. The fear that had been lurking in my chest for days now gripped me fully, and I couldn't fight it. "Who are you?" I repeated, my voice trembling. It didn't answer. Instead, a cold, invisible hand brushed across my skin, sending a chill through my body that froze me to the core. The key in my pocket pulsed with an unnatural energy, as if it were responding to the presence, to the force that now surrounded me. I reached for it, my fingers closing around the cold metal, desperate to understand. But as I touched it, the figure stepped forward, and in a low, almost gentle voice, it spoke again. "It's too late." The words sent a jolt of terror through me, as if something final was about to happen. My thoughts scrambled, but nothing made sense. The key, the gift, and it all led to this moment. I backed away, stumbling over my own feet, desperate to escape. But the figure moved with me, always just one step ahead, an unspoken understanding between us that I could not escape. In that moment, I realized with a sinking dread that there was no way out. Whatever force had taken control, whatever was waiting for me here, was far more powerful than I could comprehend. And I had no choice but to face it. The figure remained silent, an immovable shadow that blocked every escape. The apartment felt like a trap, each corner and shadow closing in on me. My chest tightened as the air grew colder, heavier, pressing against me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I only knew one thing: I was running out of time. The figure didn't move again, but the weight of its presence was all around me. Every step I took backward felt like it was being watched, every decision leading me into deeper uncertainty. My fingers clutched the key tighter, its chill cutting through my skin like it had become an extension of the darkness that surrounded me. I don't understand," I said, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" There was no answer. Instead, a sense of finality settled into the room, as though the answer had already been given and I simply hadn't understood it yet. The key in my hand began to warm, slowly at first, like a faint pulse. My heartbeat seemed to echo the rhythm, and I could feel a shift in the atmosphere. Something was changing. Something was drawing closer. I glanced back at the door. It was still closed, locked, just as I had left it. But a strange, magnetic pulse seemed to emanate from the key, as if it was calling me toward the door. My mind screamed at me to leave, but my feet remained rooted to the floor. The figure in front of me was waiting, still silent, as if it had already seen this moment unfold 1,000 times. I had to decide. I could run, tear open the door and escape into the unknown. Or I could stay. I could accept whatever was coming. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I closed my eyes for a moment, steadying myself, trying to focus. My mind flickered back to the strange gift on my desk, the note with the simple words, "Thank you for everything." The gift that had started it all, the invisible hand that had set this course in motion. Everything had led me here. Was I supposed to leave? Or had the gift been a warning? Was the key the way out, or was it the beginning of the end? I gripped the key harder, its warmth spreading through my fingers. I couldn't fight it anymore. There was no escape. I wasn't in control. A sharp sound cut through the tension, a small click, like the turning of a lock. I snapped my eyes open. The door. It was slowly creaking open, just a crack, as though some invisible hand had turned the knob. The space beyond was dark, the hallway outside a void that seemed to stretch into infinity. A breeze, cold and biting, pushed into the room, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The figure before me remained unmoving. It hadn't made a sound, but it was watching, waiting for me to make my choice. The key had already done its part. Now, it was up to me to decide. I took a step toward the door, my feet heavy as if every movement was being pulled by some unseen force. The warmth from the key intensified, almost unbearable, as I reached out with a trembling hand to push the door open wider. Something scraped against the floor. A faint whisper. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. But the sound wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from the darkness beyond the door. The whisper grew louder, clearer. He chose. The voice was familiar. My heart stopped as realization hit me like a thunderclap. It was my own voice. The door creaked wider, and a figure, another me, stepped into the room from the darkness. The figure was me, but not quite. It was like a reflection, a distorted version of myself, with hollow eyes and an expression I didn't recognize. I stumbled back, gasping for breath. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the figure, myself, was smiling, its lips curling upward into a knowing grin. No, I whispered, shaking my head. This isn't happening. But it was. The figure stepped forward, its smile widening. You've been waiting for me, it said, its voice now unmistakably my own, but cold, detached, like an echo of something that used to be me. Thank you for everything. Those words, were the same ones from the note. But they weren't a thank you. They were a farewell. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I backed away, desperate to escape, but I knew it was too late. The key had unlocked something I couldn't comprehend, something beyond time, beyond logic. I had opened the door to my own darkness. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me whole was my reflection, smiling. Have you ever checked your phone and found something you didn't remember doing? Something you could swear wasn't there before? I have. And now, I can't shake the feeling that it was never just a mistake. I was sitting in my room, scrolling through my phone one evening, not expecting anything unusual. It had been a quiet night, the kind where the world outside seems to disappear, and all you can hear are the occasional sounds of your own home settling. I was alone. Completely alone. It wasn't the first time I had been alone at night in my apartment. I liked the silence. I'd gotten used to it. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was just the weight of the darkness pressing in, or the fact that I had been feeling a little more paranoid lately. Maybe it was because of what I saw next. I was flipping through my photos when a new one appeared in my gallery. I didn't recognize it. It was a photo of my room, taken from the corner near the window. The lighting was dim, as if it had been taken at night. The bed was just barely visible, and the edges of the photo blurred like it was taken hastily. But the most disturbing part? I hadn't taken it. The camera on my phone was off. I never use the camera at night, especially not while I'm alone. And I was certain that no one had been in my room. But there it was. A photo of my room taken while I was alone in it. I had checked the door. Locked. The windows? Shut tight. I hadn't heard anyone, hadn't seen any signs of intrusion. Yet, there it was, a chilling photograph, staring back at me from the screen. I checked the time on the photo. The timestamp showed it was taken just minutes before I opened my phone. Impossible. I hadn't moved from my chair. I hadn't touched my phone since sitting down. Yet somehow, the photo had appeared. I stood up from the chair and walked over to the spot where the picture had been taken. The corner near the window. The air felt colder there. I couldn't explain why. It was as if the photo had frozen that part of the room in time, making it feel wrong. There was nothing there, of course. The room looked the same as it always did. The bed was unmade, a few books scattered on the desk. No signs of a break-in, no movement that would suggest someone had been here. Just the stillness. The quiet. But my heart was pounding now, a sense of unease creeping up my spine. I opened the photo again. I looked closely. There was nothing unusual about the photo itself. Just a regular shot of my room. But something in the corners of the image, something I couldn't quite place, made my skin crawl. I zoomed in on the edges of the room, trying to find anything that didn't belong. That's why I saw it. In the corner, near the door, a shadow. It was faint, almost indistinct. But it was there. And it wasn't part of the room. It didn't belong in that space. It was too dark, too still, too out of place. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. When I looked again, it was gone. The shadow had disappeared. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering in my chest. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. The stillness was suffocating. I looked around, as if expecting to see someone standing in the doorway or behind the curtains. But there was nothing. I sat back down on the bed, trying to breathe steadily, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had someone been in my room? Had I somehow taken the photo while I was asleep? But no, the timestamp clearly showed that I was awake. I was wide awake when it was taken. I had to know more. I couldn't let this go. I scrolled back through the photos, searching for any other strange images. But there was nothing. Just the usual selfies, pictures of my cat, and random shots from the past few weeks. Nothing like the one I had just found. I went back to the photo. I zoomed in on the shadow once more, trying to figure out what it was. It looked like a figure, but I wasn't sure. My eyes felt strained, the tension in my chest rising. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe I had been too caught up in my own thoughts. Or maybe the shadow had always been there, and I had never noticed it. But one thing was certain now, whatever it was, it had been in my room. It had been there, in the dark, waiting for me to see it. And somehow, it had left a message for me. In the form of a photo. I couldn't stop shaking. I had to get out of this room. But where could I go? Would it follow me? The night dragged on like a bad dream, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I wanted to call someone, tell them about the photo, but who would believe me? How could I explain that my own phone had taken a photo of my room while I was alone? How could I explain the shadow in the corner that seemed to fade every time I tried to focus on it? I stood up from the bed and paced around the room, my footsteps echoing off the walls in the quiet stillness. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if something was watching me. I tried to ignore the feeling, but it was impossible. I had to do something. I grabbed my phone again, staring at the image on the screen. There it was, my room, just as I had left it, but with that strange, lingering shadow in the corner. I zoomed in again, but this time I swore I saw something else. Something that wasn't there before. A movement. The shadow, once a mere dark patch in the corner, had shifted. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. My heart skipped a beat. I backed away from the screen, my breath catching in my throat. The feeling of unease was growing, taking over every part of my mind. I couldn't keep staring at that photo. I needed to stop, but I couldn't. I scrolled through my phone again, checking for any new photos, any signs that this was some sort of glitch or prank. But there were no new images. No updates. Just that one. Just the same damn photo. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Just a mistake. Maybe a bug in the phone's camera. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I opened the camera app, just to make sure everything was normal. The lens was working fine, no strange reflections or glitches. I snapped a quick photo of the empty room, just a picture of the bed, the desk, the open window. The same as before. No shadow. No figure lurking in the corner. But when I went back to the gallery, there was something different. There, at the very bottom of my photo roll, was another picture. A new one. I hadn't taken it. I hadn't even been near the camera. I opened it slowly, dreading what I might see. It was a close-up shot of my bed, but something was different. The sheets were disturbed, as though someone had been lying there. And there, in the center of the image, was a handprint pressed into the fabric of the blanket. I dropped the phone. My head was spinning. I couldn't breathe. I was frozen in place, unable to move or think clearly. Someone had been in my room. Someone had touched my bed, and I hadn't heard a thing. No creaks of the floorboards, no whisper of footsteps. Just silence. Absolute silence. I ran to the door, locked it again, and backed away. I looked around the room, searching for any sign of an intruder. There was nothing. No one. Just the empty walls and the stillness that felt more suffocating by the second. I couldn't stay here. Not anymore. I needed to leave. I needed to get out. I grabbed my jacket, threw it on, and rushed for the door. But as I reached for the handle, something stopped me. A sound. A soft, almost imperceptible creak. The floorboard just outside the door. It was faint, but it was there. I froze. My hand hovered over the doorknob, my heart hammering in my chest. The silence stretched on, but the sound hadn't gone away. It was getting louder. The creaking was followed by another noise. This time, it was a slow drag, as if something was being pulled across the floor. It was right outside my door. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. The drag continued, followed by a pause. Then, a light tapping, almost rhythmic. A tap, tap, tap. I couldn't help it. I took a step back, my eyes locked on the door as though I could somehow will the sound away. But it didn't stop. The tapping continued, and I could hear it now, closer, much closer than before. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to check, but my hand moved instinctively. I pulled it out, my fingers trembling as I unlocked the screen. There was a new notification. A message. It read, "I see you." I dropped the phone again. The tapping stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. And then there was a voice. A whisper, low and muffled, but unmistakable. "Let me in." The whisper sent chills down my spine. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as I stood frozen in place, my back pressed against the cold wall. Every part of me screamed to run, to get away, but my legs were rooted to the floor as though some invisible force had pinned me down. The silence after the whisper was even worse. The weight of it pressed on me, suffocating me, making it feel like the walls themselves were closing in. My breath was shallow, my heart racing, pounding against my chest. I could feel the cold sweat on my skin, my body trembling. I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there. I couldn't wait for whatever was out there to make its next move. My hand hovered near the door handle again, but I didn't dare turn it. The tapping had stopped, but the feeling of something, or someone, being right outside was too much to bear. I thought about the photos, the handprint, the message. My mind raced, but I couldn't come up with a single explanation. There was no way this was a prank. No way someone was playing some cruel joke on me. This felt too real, too immediate. With a deep breath, I forced myself to move. I grabbed the nearest object I could find, a lamp, and held it up in front of me like a weapon. My heart hammered in my chest, and every creak of the house seemed to echo in the silence. I was so aware of every noise now, so hyper-aware of the faintest sound, the smallest movement. I reached for the door handle again, my fingers shaking, but this time I didn't hesitate. I twisted it slowly, trying to be as quiet as possible. The door groaned in protest as it opened a crack, just enough for me to peer through. There was nothing. The hallway was empty, just a stretch of dimly lit space leading to the living room. I leaned out slightly, scanning the area. Nothing. No one. It was as though the world outside my room had frozen. I took a step forward, my pulse still racing, the lamp held tightly in my grip. I made my way toward the hallway, every instinct screaming for me to turn around, to go back into the safety of my room and lock the door behind me. But I couldn't. Not now. Not after everything I had seen. The hallway stretched ahead, unnaturally quiet, with no sounds of movement, no footsteps. It almost felt like I was walking through a dream, where everything was familiar but off in some way, like the air itself was too thick to breathe. I stepped closer to the living room, the shadows stretching long across the floor. The only light came from the faint glow of the kitchen, the fridge door slightly ajar, as though someone had left it open in a hurry. My mind kept drifting back to the photo, to the handprint. I couldn't shake the thought that whatever was happening wasn't just an intrusion. It was something else. Suddenly, the floor creaked beneath my feet. I froze. The sound had come from the living room. I turned toward it, heart racing in my chest. The room was dark, save for the low light spilling from the kitchen. I could see the shape of the furniture, couch, coffee table, the TV, and nothing more. But the creak. It wasn't the floor. It was something else. Something deeper. Something moving. I took a step back, my hand tightening around the lamp. The sound came again, louder this time, closer. A low groan, as though something was shifting. Something that didn't belong. And then I heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable, coming from the living room. "Why are you running?" The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried through the stillness of the house like a cold breeze. It sounded familiar, like someone I knew, but I couldn't place it. I couldn't even recognize the tone. I took a few more steps back, the lamp now raised in front of me, ready to swing. But there was nothing. Nothing except the shadows, the cold air, and that growing, unbearable sense of being watched. Then I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway of the living room. A shape that wasn't there before, outlined by the faint light from the kitchen. It was tall and slender, and for a moment, I couldn't make out any features. Just the silhouette. A shadow in the dark. I couldn't breathe. My legs locked in place, refusing to move, refusing to let me run. It was as if the figure was holding me there, trapped in place, just by its presence. The figure took a step forward, and then another. Slowly. Methodically. Like it was savoring my fear. And then, in the dead silence, the figure spoke again. "You've seen me, haven't you?" I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to respond. How could I? I didn't even know what this was. Was it real? Or was it just my mind playing tricks on me? I took a step back. Another. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it would burst. And then, without thinking, I ran. I turned and bolted toward the door, the figure's voice echoing in my mind, "You can't hide." I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever. The door was right there, but it felt miles away. Every step I took felt heavier, as though the air itself was pushing against me, trying to hold me back. I reached the door. I grabbed the handle. But just as I was about to yank it open, I heard it again. The tapping. Slow. Steady. Right behind me. The door wouldn't open. And then the whisper came once more, just a breath in my ear. "Let me in." I froze. The tapping stopped. The whisper died away. But the door was still locked. And now, I was trapped. Panic surged through me as I yanked at the door handle again, desperate to break free, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, and no matter how hard I pulled, it refused to give. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, my body trembling with a mixture of fear and frustration. I could feel the walls of the house closing in, the air thick with a presence I couldn't escape. The tapping resumed, louder now. Closer. It sounded like it was right behind me, each tap like a beat of a drum in my chest, synchronized with my frantic pulse. My mind raced, thoughts colliding, none of them making sense. How had it gotten so close? How had I let myself be trapped in here? I had to find another way out. I couldn't just stand here. I glanced around the room, looking for any way to escape, any window, any other door. But there was nothing. The living room, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a maze, closing in on me. The shadows had deepened, stretching unnaturally along the walls, as though they were alive. The light from the kitchen flickered, casting eerie shapes on the floor. The tapping stopped again. And then, as if to replace it, there was a low, rasping breath from just behind me. I spun around, heart pounding in my throat. The figure was there again, standing in the doorway, but this time I could make out more details. It was tall, unnervingly thin, with a distorted, featureless face that was both human and not. Its limbs were too long, too thin, like they didn't belong. The space around it seemed to warp, as though the very air was bending to accommodate its unnatural form. Its presence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. My skin crawled. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The figure didn't advance, but its gaze, though there were no eyes to see, was unrelenting. It felt as though it was watching me, waiting. "Why are you hiding?" the voice whispered, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command, an order that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "I can feel you." I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. I couldn't let fear take over. I had to act. I had to think. My hand found the lamp again, the cold metal reassuring in my grip. I raised it slightly, unsure of what I was planning to do with it. Could I fight this thing? Could I escape? The thought was overwhelming, but I couldn't just stand there, frozen. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. I had no idea if it would work, but I had to try. "Go away." The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, silent. For a moment, I thought maybe my words had had some effect. Maybe it would leave me alone. But then, the air seemed to vibrate, the walls pulsing with an unnatural energy. And then, with horrifying clarity, I saw it, the shadow behind the figure, stretching toward me. A dark, twisted version of the room I knew. The figure wasn't alone. There were others, more shadows, more figures, each one taller, more distorted than the last. I backed away slowly, my pulse thrumming in my ears. I needed to leave, but there was no way out. The door, the window, the walls, they were all closing in. I had to find a way to break free, to get out before they came closer, before they consumed me. Suddenly, the phone buzzed again in my pocket. I didn't even look at it. The thought of seeing another message, another photo, was too much. I couldn't handle it. I had to focus. I turned away from the figure, my mind racing for a plan, but as I moved, I felt it, a cold hand, light but firm, on my shoulder. It wasn't a touch that I felt physically, but one that crawled under my skin, icy and suffocating. I could feel its presence, its pressure, its suffocating grip. I froze, my body stiff with fear. The figure leaned closer, its breath brushing my ear. "You can't run. You can't hide." The room seemed to spin. The shadows pressed in, the air thick with the smell of something rotten. I could feel the weight of the darkness closing in on me. It was as if the very room itself had turned against me. I had to act. Now, there was no other choice. In one quick motion, I turned, grabbing the lamp and swinging it toward the figure. The blow landed, but it didn't feel like I hit anything solid. The lamp passed right through it, as though the figure were made of smoke, a shadow in the darkness. I stumbled back, heart pounding, mind reeling. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But everything felt so real, so tangible. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't fight it. Not like this. The figure didn't react to the blow. Instead, it took a slow step forward. It was getting closer, its shadow stretching, its presence overwhelming. I bolted. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get out. The front door. The back. The kitchen. I didn't know. But just as I turned toward the exit, the phone buzzed again, louder this time, almost deafening. I reached for it, almost afraid to check, but something inside me made me pull it out. Another message. "Look behind you." I didn't want to, but I had no choice. I turned around, and there it was, the figure, standing just inches away. And in its hand, a phone. My phone. It was holding it. The screen glowing. The same picture I had seen earlier, my room, the shadows in the corner. But this time, the figure was in it. It was standing right there, in the picture. Its twisted face was staring straight at me. The whisper returned, low and cold. It's too late now. The figure moved closer, and the world around me began to fade, the darkness swallowing everything. And then, the phone slipped from my hand. The room went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor. The cold hardwood pressed against my cheek, and I could hear the faint hum of the city outside, normal, mundane, as though nothing had happened. But something in the air felt different. Thick. Stale. Wrong. I stood up slowly, my body sore, and glanced around. The living room, still dimly lit by the morning light creeping through the blinds, appeared as it always had. Nothing had changed. Everything was exactly where it should have been. The couch, the coffee table, the empty corner by the window. But the silence, it felt too heavy, too quiet. I reached for my phone instinctively, but when I pulled it from my pocket, the screen was blank. No messages. No new photos. No strange notifications. Just a black screen that seemed so ordinary, so empty. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. I turned the phone on, my thumb pressing the power button with a mixture of dread and curiosity. The screen flickered to life, and for a brief moment, my heart skipped a beat. But there were no new pictures. No warnings. No figures standing at the edge of my room. I felt a flicker of hope, but it was fleeting. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that I was still trapped in some twisted cycle I couldn't escape. I glanced at the clock on the wall, 8:37 in the morning. The same time as when I'd first seen the message. It was like a loop. Like time was repeating itself, each moment blending into the next. I couldn't explain it, but the sense of déjà vu overwhelmed me. There was a knock at the door. A soft, polite tap, like the knock of a neighbor or a delivery person. But it sent a chill through my spine. I didn't want to answer it. I didn't want to open that door again. But the knock came again, more insistent this time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. I couldn't stop the fear from creeping in. Nothing. Only silence. Then, slowly, the door creaked open on its own. Just a few inches at first, then wider, until it was fully ajar. I stood there, frozen, staring at the empty doorway. No one was there. But something told me to step outside. Reluctantly, I moved forward, heart pounding in my chest. Each step felt heavier, as though the weight of the air itself was pressing me back. I peered around the doorway, scanning the hall. It was empty. Not a soul in sight. Just the soft hum of the building's old pipes and the faint murmur of voices from far down the corridor. I took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. The world around me seemed eerily still, as though it were holding its breath. Every sound was amplified, every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, every distant noise echoing in the empty space. Then I heard it. A soft, faint tapping, almost too quiet to hear at first. But it grew louder. Closer. Like the sound of footsteps, creeping slowly toward me. I turned around, heart racing. The hallway was empty. There was no one there. But the sound of those steps, growing louder with every passing second, was unmistakable. I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. My eyes darted around, trying to locate the source, but everything was still. Too still. It was as if the very walls were pressing in on me, closing me off from the rest of the world. I backed away toward the door to my apartment, but as I reached for the handle, the phone buzzed again. I flinched, almost dropping it. The screen lit up with a new message. "Look behind you." My blood ran cold. I couldn't breathe. The footsteps stopped, and for a split second, everything was silent again. I slowly turned around. The hallway was still empty. But in the distance, just past the bend, a shadow lingered. A tall, thin figure, standing perfectly still. It was too far away to make out details, but I could feel it, its presence. The same sensation I had felt that night. The same overwhelming weight in the air. The same sense that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me, waiting. I turned back to the door, desperate to escape. But when I tried to open it, it wouldn't move. The door was locked. I pounded on it with my fists, shouting, begging for someone to help me. But no one came. No one could hear me. I was trapped. Alone. And then, the tapping started again, louder this time. Closer. Too close. I turned back to the hallway. The figure was now standing right in front of me, its distorted shape looming in the doorway. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough. And then, just like that, everything went black. When I woke up again, I was back in my room. The phone buzzed in my pocket. I took it out, dreading what I would see. Another message. Another photo. But this time, when I looked at the screen, I knew what was coming. It was a picture of my room. The same room I had just woken up in. And in the corner, standing in the shadow, was the figure. It was smiling. The cycle had begun again. Have you ever stumbled upon something that doesn't quite belong? Something that seems to have appeared out of nowhere, yet feels oddly familiar? That's exactly what happened to me one seemingly ordinary afternoon in the city library. It was just another day, cloudy, drizzly, the kind of weather that made you want to stay inside. I was looking for a new book to read, the usual distraction from my busy life. I wandered through the aisles, the soft rustling of pages filling the air. The smell of paper and dust was comforting, as it always was. I had been walking for what felt like an eternity, gliding my fingers along the spines of books I had no intention of reading, when something caught my eye. It wasn't the book itself, not at first, but the way it sat on the shelf. It was out of place, as if it didn't belong. A single book, sitting just a bit too far out from the others. Curious, I reached for it. It was a hardback, its cover an unassuming shade of gray, worn at the edges. There were no markings, no title, nothing to indicate its contents. Just the gray cover. I pulled it down and opened it, my fingers tingling with a strange sense of anticipation. The first page was blank. But when I turned to the next page, my breath caught. There, in black ink, was my name. Emma Roberts. I blinked, unsure whether my eyes were playing tricks on me. But there it was, unmistakable. The next line sent a chill through my spine. Address 43 Maple Street. I froze. My heart raced. I looked around the room, expecting someone to be standing behind me, watching. But the library was empty, the rows of bookshelves stretching out into the distance, silent and still. How could this be? I hadn't put my address in any books. I had never seen this book before. I flipped through the pages in a frenzy, trying to find some explanation, but they were all blank. Page after page, nothing but emptiness. It was as though the book had been written for me, but with no purpose other than to confuse and frighten. A hand touched my shoulder. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. Turning quickly, I saw the librarian standing behind me, her face unreadable. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice low and calm. I hesitated, the book still clutched tightly in my hands. This book. I found it here. But it has my name and address written inside. How is that possible? The librarian stared at me for a long moment, then glanced at the book in my hands. She didn't seem surprised, but her eyes flickered with something I couldn't place. Concern? Fear? Or perhaps something darker. "That book should not be here," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Shouldn't be here?" I repeated, my voice trembling. She nodded, but before she could say anything more, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Another librarian approached, and I knew instantly that something was wrong. They exchanged a few words, too quiet for me to hear, and then the librarian turned back to me. "Please, leave the book here." It's not for you," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. Confused, I handed her the book. My mind was racing with questions, but before I could speak, she was already walking away, carrying the book as though it were something fragile, dangerous even. I wanted to ask more, but the words wouldn't come. The sense of unease lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. I left the library that afternoon, but the feeling stayed with me. The strange book. The librarian's reaction. My name written in it, like a warning. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Later that evening, I sat in my apartment, staring at the walls, my mind replaying the events over and over. Something wasn't right. There was a piece missing from the puzzle, a gap I couldn't fill. I tried to push it from my mind, but it gnawed at me, relentless. I decided to go back the next day, to find the book, and perhaps to find the truth. The following day, I found myself standing outside the library again. It was early, the sun just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the streets. I don't know why I had returned so soon. Maybe I was looking for answers. Or maybe I was hoping it had all been a mistake, a weird coincidence that would somehow explain itself. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The door to the library opened with a soft creak as I stepped inside, the familiar scent of old books surrounding me. It was almost peaceful, like nothing strange had happened at all. The library was empty, save for the elderly librarian sitting at the desk, eyes buried in a thick book. I tried to ignore the unease bubbling in my chest and walked toward the section where I found the mysterious book. I moved slowly, as if expecting something to happen. A change in the air, a sudden shift in the atmosphere. But nothing happened. The shelves stood as they always had, rows of dusty volumes and faded spines. When I reached the spot where I had found the book, my heart sank. There was nothing there. The shelf was empty. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaking as I turned to the librarian at the desk. She looked up, her expression neutral. Did you happen to see a gray book here yesterday? It was. Gray book, she interrupted, her brow furrowing. I'm sorry, dear. We don't have anything like that here. My breath caught in my throat. But I saw it. It had my name in it. My address. She shook her head, almost as if she hadn't heard me. Perhaps you're mistaken. We don't have anything like that. I was about to argue when she stood up, her movement stiff and deliberate. Is there anything else I can help you with today? She asked, her tone colder than before. It was as though she had already decided the conversation was over. My stomach twisted with confusion and frustration. I turned to leave, but then something caught my eye. Near the back of the library, a door I had never noticed before stood slightly ajar. It wasn't a door that led to the restrooms or the staff areas. It was just there, tucked away in a corner, hidden behind stacks of books. My curiosity got the better of me, and before I could think, I was walking toward it. The moment I touched the doorknob, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. Don't, the librarian called out sharply. I froze, my hand still on the door. What's behind there? I asked, turning slowly to face her. Her face was pale now, her lips tight, as if she were holding back something important. You don't want to go in there, she said softly, almost pleading. But I wasn't about to let it go. Something told me that whatever was behind that door was the key to everything. To the book. To my name in it. To the strange sensation that had settled over me since I'd found it. I need to know, I said, my voice more determined than I felt. The librarian's eyes darted to the door and back to me. It's not a place for you. You're not meant to see it. Her words felt like a warning, but they only made me more desperate. Please. I need to know what's going on. The air around us seemed to grow heavier, the silence between us stretching thin. I could feel my pulse racing in my ears, each second more unbearable than the last. Finally, with a resigned sigh, she stepped aside. Go ahead, she said, her voice barely a whisper. But don't say I didn't warn you. I opened the door. The space beyond was dark, and for a moment, I thought I had made a mistake. But then my eyes adjusted, and I saw a small room tucked away from the rest of the library. The walls were lined with shelves full of books, all old and worn, their pages yellowing with age. Some of them looked like they hadn't been touched in years. And there, on a small pedestal in the center of the room, was a single book. Its cover was darker than I remembered, almost black, with no markings at all. But the moment I saw it, I knew it was the same book. The same gray book. I approached it slowly, my fingers trembling. The room seemed to close in around me, the silence almost deafening. When I reached the book, I hesitated before picking it up. It felt heavier than I expected, as though it had been waiting for me. I opened it, and again, there it was, my name. Emma Roberts. Address, 43 Maple Street. But this time, there was something else. On the page, written in a delicate script, was a message. You were always meant to find this. I recoiled, my heart pounding in my chest. My breath caught in my throat as the words sank in. This wasn't just a coincidence. Someone, or something, was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't alone. Suddenly, the room felt colder. The shadows seemed to stretch, creeping along the walls, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the doorway. I spun around, my heart racing. but there was no one there. I had to leave. I had to get out. But as I turned to walk away, I heard a whisper, barely audible, like the rustling of paper. Emma. It was my name, and it was coming from behind me. My breath hitched in my throat, the air around me suddenly dense and suffocating. I stood frozen, staring at the doorway, but there was nothing, no shadow, no figure. Just the deep, quiet stillness of the library, a place that had once felt so safe. I told myself I was imagining things. I must have been. It was late, I hadn't slept properly, and the stress of the book was starting to get to me. My mind was playing tricks. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something in the very air seemed off, as if the room itself had shifted. I glanced at the book again, still open in my hands. The words "you were always meant to find this" haunted me. Who had read something like that? Who knew my name? I swallowed hard, forcing myself to step away from the pedestal. But as I did, my foot caught on something soft, and I stumbled backward. My eyes darted to the floor, and there, lying beneath the pedestal, was something that had not been there before. A small, crumpled piece of paper. I knelt down to pick it up, my hands shaking. Unfolding it, I saw a single sentence written in the same delicate script as the message in the book. Do not trust the librarian. The words seemed to burn into my mind, a warning I couldn't ignore. My pulse quickened, and I felt a chill run down my spine. My eyes flicked nervously to the doorway. The librarian was still standing outside, waiting, watching. Why had she warned me not to come in here? What was behind her cryptic advice? I shoved the paper into my pocket and stood up, my heart racing. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of here, away from this strange room and the increasingly unsettling presence of the librarian. But the moment I took a step toward the door, the faint sound of footsteps behind me stopped me in my tracks. I turned sharply, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the room was empty. My breath caught in my chest as I scanned the corners, looking for anything that might explain the feeling of being watched. But there was nothing. I pressed forward, eager to leave, and made my way toward the door. The librarian stood in her usual spot, her eyes now following my every movement. She didn't say a word as I passed her, but her gaze was enough to send a jolt of unease through me. I had the distinct feeling that she knew something I didn't. Is everything all right? She asked, her voice smooth, almost too calm. I hesitated, glancing at her once more. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place, that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I started to speak, but stopped myself. I couldn't tell her about the book. Not yet. Not until I understood what was really happening. So instead, I simply nodded and made my way toward the exit. But just as I reached the door, I heard her voice again. Be careful, Emma, she said, her words softer now, laced with something almost like pity. Not everything is meant to be discovered. The door slammed shut behind me with a force that left my heart racing. I stood there for a moment, staring at the building as 1,000 questions swirled in my mind. I had to know more. I couldn't let it go. But as I walked away from the library, a strange thought crossed my mind. What if the book wasn't just a random piece of forgotten history? What if it was something more? What if it was calling to me? I couldn't shake the feeling that the library, and more specifically the book, was following me. The words on the page, the cryptic warning, the unsettling familiarity of the story, all of it had burrowed deep into my mind. I tried to push it aside, to pretend it hadn't affected me, but my thoughts kept returning to the same disturbing conclusion: someone knew more about me than I did about myself. I spent the next few days trying to act normal, but the world felt off-kilter, as if something unseen was slowly tightening around me. I couldn't even look at my phone without wondering if someone had been reading my messages or monitoring my every move. It was late one evening, after work, when the curiosity returned with a vengeance. I couldn't just ignore what had happened in that library. What was that book? Why did it have my name on it, and why did the librarian seem so intent on keeping me away from it? I pulled out my phone, a sense of dread weighing on me as I navigated to the library's website. The search bar stared back at me, empty and accusing. I typed the title of the book, The Echo of the Lost, and hit enter. The search results were sparse, with only a handful of mentions. There was nothing particularly special about the book. It seemed like any other forgotten relic in the library's vast collection. But there was one thing that caught my eye, a link buried deep in the results that led to a single blog post. I clicked on it. The page was barely formatted, the text barely readable, but one line stood out. The book chooses who it's meant for. You may not always understand why, but it will always find its way to you. I shivered as I read it, the same unease from the library creeping back into my chest. Who wrote this? And why did it sound so eerily familiar? I scrolled down further. The author of the blog post had added a personal note at the bottom. I was once like you. Curious, intrigued, and then terrified. I don't know what's worse, the fear of being chosen or the fear of knowing too much. The last sentence made my stomach twist. Chosen? What was this all about? I shut off the phone and set it down, pacing the room. I felt trapped in a game I didn't understand, and the stakes were getting higher with each new piece of information I uncovered. The lines between reality and whatever was happening with the book blurred, and I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The phone buzzed. I looked down. It was a message, but not from anyone I knew. Don't look for answers. They will find you. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. My fingers hovered over the screen, but I didn't dare respond. I didn't want to. I was already in too deep. My hands trembled as I set the phone aside, the unease gnawing at my insides. The air around me seemed to thicken, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, someone, in the corner of my vision. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Just the darkened apartment, the low hum of the refrigerator in the background, and the oppressive silence. Then, a soft sound, like pages turning, echoed from the other room. The noise was faint, but unmistakable. My heart leaped in my chest. I hadn't touched the book since that day in the library. It was still at my desk, lying there, waiting. Slowly, I walked toward it, the sound of the pages turning growing louder with each step. It was as if the book itself was alive, beckoning me closer. I reached the desk, and there it was. The book, open to a new page. I hadn't opened it. I hadn't touched it. But the page was now filled with new words. You can never escape. You are part of the story now. The words seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if they were alive, as if they were watching me. My breath quickened as I backed away, and then I heard it. The whisper. It was coming from behind the book, from within the pages themselves. Faint at first, like a soft breeze, but it grew louder, more distinct. You shouldn't have read it, Emma. I turned toward the voice, but there was no one there. No one. The whisper continued, relentless, as if the book were speaking directly into my mind. It was always meant for you. I turned on my heel, desperate to escape the suffocating presence of the book. But as I reached the door, I glanced back one final time. The book was gone. The desk was empty. I couldn't breathe. My heart raced, and my pulse hammered in my ears as I scanned the room, desperately searching for the book. It was gone. It was no longer on the desk. No trace of it remained, and yet the whisper still lingered, hanging in the air like a cloud of dread. I backed away from the empty desk, my hands shaking, my mind scrambling for some sort of explanation. I had to be hallucinating. It was impossible. The book had been there. I had seen it with my own eyes. I had heard it speak. I had felt its presence. But now, there was nothing. The silence was deafening, and the weight of it pressed down on me, suffocating me. "Emma," the voice whispered again, softer this time, as if it were just outside my reach, teasing me. "You're not alone." I stumbled back toward the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I couldn't stay here anymore. I had to leave. I had to get out of this apartment before whatever was haunting me took hold completely. As I turned to open the door, something caught my eye. A flicker of light coming from the corner of the room. The light was faint, like the glow of a screen in the dark. I froze. It was the book. It was glowing. I rushed over to the corner, my legs weak beneath me. There, on the floor, was the book, open to a new page. The same page that had been in the library, the one with my name written on it. And there, beneath my name, a new line had appeared. "You cannot escape. The story has already begun." My throat went dry. My mind raced, but no thoughts made it past the fog of terror in my head. I reached out toward the book, my fingers trembling. I wanted to close it, to shut it out, to end this nightmare. But as soon as my hand made contact with the page, the room went dark. The air turned cold, the temperature dropping rapidly as if the very room were exhaling a frozen breath. I tried to pull my hand away, but it was as if I was glued to the book. The words on the page blurred, shifting and twisting, as if they were alive and writhing in response to my touch. Then, as I struggled, the whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent. "You are part of the story now, Emma." The words seemed to rise from the pages and wrap themselves around me, encasing me in their grip. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The darkness around me deepened, pulling me into its depths. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through my chest, as if something had pierced me from the inside. My vision blurred, and the world around me dissolved into a chaotic whirl of shapes and shadows. The whispers turned into a cacophony, voices overlapping, all speaking at once, drowning out everything else. Then, there was silence. When I opened my eyes again, I was no longer in my apartment. I was standing in the library, surrounded by rows upon rows of books. The familiar scent of paper and dust filled the air, but there was something wrong. Something off. I looked around in a panic, but no one was there. The library was empty, silent, as though it had been abandoned for years. The shelves loomed over me, dark and oppressive, as if they were closing in. And then, I saw it. The book. It was lying on a pedestal in the center of the room, its pages open. My name was written on the cover, the same as before. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to know what would happen if I did. But my body moved of its own accord, drawn to it like a magnet. As my hand hovered over the book, the whispers began again, so loud, so clear I could almost feel them inside my skull. You are part of the story now, Emma. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for what was to come. But as my fingers brushed against the page, everything around me froze. The library, the books, the whispers, all of it came to a sudden halt. And then, in the silence, I saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the room, shrouded in shadow. It was tall, its features indistinct, like a ghost or wraith. It stepped forward, its presence filling the space with an overwhelming sense of dread. Welcome to the story, Emma. The figure's voice was soft, but its words carried the weight of something far older than time itself. The air grew thick with an unseen presence, suffocating, pressing in from all sides. I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, unable to escape. And then, the figure spoke again. You'll never leave. I felt the ground beneath me shift, as though the library itself was changing, becoming something else. Something darker. Something more dangerous. And in that moment, I understood. The story hadn't just chosen me, it had claimed me. And there was no escape. Have you ever met someone who knew more about you than they should? Not just facts, but things no one could possibly know, things that make you question if they've been watching you, or worse, reading your mind. It started like any other evening. I was in the local supermarket, grabbing the usual groceries for the week ahead. The cold aisles and the hum of fluorescent lights above were familiar, comfortable even. It was quiet, not many shoppers milling around at that time. Just the soft beeping of the register and the occasional shuffle of a cart. I grabbed a carton of eggs and moved down the aisle, barely noticing the man standing by the canned goods until he spoke. Big plans for next week? He asked, his voice casual but with an edge to it that made me stop. I turned slightly, unsure if he was talking to me. He wasn't looking at me directly, his eyes were scanning the shelves, but there was something about his tone that felt aimed at me. Excuse me? I replied, my eyebrows furrowing. I wasn't in the mood for small talk, especially from strangers. He turned his head just enough to meet my gaze, a faint smile creeping across his lips. I said, big plans for next week, he repeated. You've got a lot coming up. Your week's packed, isn't it? I froze. My mouth went dry. How could he possibly know that? I hadn't mentioned anything to anyone about what I had planned. I hadn't even thought much about it myself, but in that moment, I realized he was right. I have a few things. Yes, I stammered. How do you know that? He shrugged, a motion that seemed entirely too nonchalant given the situation. Just a hunch. I forced a laugh, trying to brush it off as some sort of weird coincidence, but something in his expression made my skin crawl. He didn't look like someone who was just being friendly or making conversation. There was something too knowing about the way he looked at me, like he was expecting me to respond in a particular way. What kind of plans are you talking about? I asked cautiously, not sure why I was engaging with this strange man. His smile grew a little wider, and for a second, I wondered if he could hear the frantic beating of my heart in the sudden silence that stretched between us. Well, I know you're going to visit your sister on Wednesday, he said, the words slipping from his lips like they had been rehearsed. You'll be leaving early in the morning, right? You're taking the train this time, not driving. And then you'll stay for dinner. It's her birthday, after all. But after that, you're meeting your friend Rachel on Thursday evening for drinks at that bar you both like. the one with the dim lighting and the good cocktails. He paused, as if waiting for me to confirm what he just said. Does that sound right? I felt the blood drain from my face. How did he know that? No one knew the details of my week like that. I stepped back a little, my hands suddenly clammy as I tightened my grip on the basket of groceries. This couldn't be happening. I glanced around the store, searching for anyone else, but the aisle was empty except for us. Who are you? I asked, my voice shaking despite my attempt to sound calm. How do you know that? The man didn't immediately answer. He just smiled again, his eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite place. You'd be surprised what I know, he said softly, almost to himself. I know a lot of things, actually. I took another step back, my mind racing as my thoughts collided in a frenzy of confusion and fear. I didn't understand. How could he know what I had planned? What was happening? Before I could speak again, the man turned his gaze back to the shelves, his attention completely shifting as if nothing had happened. Anyway, I should get going, he said, almost upsetly. Enjoy your week. I stood there, stunned, unable to process everything he had just told me. I stared at him for a few more seconds, trying to make sense of the situation, but before I could say anything more, he disappeared into the next aisle, vanishing from sight as though he had never been there at all. I stood frozen for a moment, still gripping the basket in my hands as the reality of what had just happened sank in. My pulse was racing. I could feel the sweat on the back of my neck, and the hairs on my arms were standing on end. How did he know all that? Who was he? I quickly finished my shopping, my thoughts a whirlwind. As I left the store, I checked my phone, no messages. Nothing out of the ordinary. I had no answers. Only more questions. I hurried to my car, desperate to get home. But as I glanced over my shoulder while locking the car door, I thought I saw a figure standing in the parking lot near the store's exit. It was him. The man was there, standing just out of reach, watching me. And this time, his smile was wider, knowing, as if he was aware of everything that was about to happen next. I got in my car quickly, my hands trembling on the wheel. I didn't dare look back. I just drove. But even as I left the parking lot behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting for me. The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to go about my life as usual, work, errands, and the occasional evening spent with friends. But every time I picked up my phone, or when I was alone, the encounter in the supermarket crept back into my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, like there was some invisible presence lingering just out of sight. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder whenever I was walking down the street or in my apartment. Each time I'd see a stranger in the crowd, my heart would skip a beat, wondering if it was him. The worst part was that I couldn't stop thinking about his words. He knew everything: my sister's birthday, the train ride, dinner plans, drinks with Rachel. How could he have known that? There was no way he could have followed me and heard me talking about it. I had barely mentioned any of it to anyone. No one but my sister and Rachel knew those details. I tried calling Rachel the next day, just to ask if she noticed anything unusual. She laughed it off, telling me I was probably just paranoid. You're always overthinking things, she said. Maybe it was just some weird guy trying to get a conversation started. You should relax. But I couldn't relax. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. It wasn't just that he knew my plans, it was the way he spoke to me. The ease with which he shared personal details that no one else could know. It felt invasive, like he had been watching me from the shadows for far longer than I realized. Later that week, the unease continued to grow. I noticed more odd occurrences, strangers staring at me too long, the same man from the supermarket appearing in the background of my daily routine. But each time I tried to approach someone or ask if they'd seen him, they'd act as if I was imagining it. The man wasn't there when I looked, and no one remembered seeing anyone unusual. I decided to try and shake the feeling off. I went to my usual coffee shop and sat by the window, hoping to distract myself with a book and some fresh air. But as I glanced up, I saw him again, standing across the street, just watching. He was too far for me to approach, but I could feel his gaze piercing through me. It was the same eerie, knowing look from the supermarket. I quickly gathered my things and left, trying to ignore the chill running down my spine. I had to get away from him. I couldn't let him control my life like this. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind wouldn't stop racing. I checked all the locks on my doors, made sure the windows were closed tight, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. I wanted to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his eyes studying me, calculating his next move. And then, at 3 a.m, my phone buzzed. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest. I looked at the screen. No new notifications. Just one new message in my inbox from an unknown number. The message simply read, "You'll be taking the train at 7:30 a.m. tomorrow. Don't forget to pack your umbrella." I froze. My breath caught in my throat. He knew about my plans again. How? Why? The train. The time. The umbrella. It was all so specific, so unerringly accurate. I scrambled out of bed and grabbed my phone, trying to call my sister, but the call wouldn't go through. My mind raced. I had to leave. I couldn't stay there, not knowing where he was, what he might do next. I grabbed my bag and rushed out of the house, my pulse hammering in my chest as I rushed to the station. But when I arrived, everything felt wrong. It was too quiet. The platform was nearly empty, save for a few people scattered here and there. I checked the time, 7:30 a.m. The train was supposed to be arriving soon, but there was something off about the whole situation. And then I saw him again. He was standing on the far end of the platform, leaning casually against a pillar, his eyes fixed on me. The same knowing, unnerving smile spread across his face. "You're on time," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the platform. "I thought you might try to avoid it. But here you are." I froze, not knowing what to say or do. The train arrived, the doors sliding open with a soft hiss, but I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. He stepped closer, his smile growing even wider. "Don't worry, you'll make it. Just don't miss this one." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words sinking in. What was he implying? What was going to happen if I didn't get on that train? Before I could answer, he turned and walked toward the end of the platform, disappearing into the crowd of commuters. The train's whistle blew again, and the doors began to close. Without thinking, I stepped forward, my legs moving on their own. I had to get on. I didn't know why, but something inside me told me that I couldn't stay here. I stepped into the train just as the doors closed behind me, and as I found a seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led somewhere. Somewhere I didn't want to go. And then, in the quiet hum of the train, I felt it again, the sensation of someone watching. I glanced up, and there, sitting across from me, was him. He was smiling. But this time, his eyes didn't hold the same knowing warmth. They were cold, empty. And I realized then that I was no longer in control of my own story. The train rattled along the tracks, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears. I couldn't stop glancing at him, sitting across from me, his eyes never leaving my face. He hadn't spoken since he boarded, but his smile remained, stretching unnervingly wide. I tried to focus on the passing scenery, forcing myself to breathe steadily. I needed to think, to understand what was happening. How did he know my every move? Was this just some strange coincidence, or was there something more? I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just an odd encounter with a bizarre stranger. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It couldn't be. The train's low hum seemed to amplify my thoughts, growing louder until it felt like the world outside the windows had disappeared entirely. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were heading into the unknown, that this train ride was not just a trip to the next station. It was something much worse. The man didn't speak. He just stared, his eyes gleaming as if he were studying me, waiting for me to make a move. I wanted to look away, to ignore him, but something held me in place. The power of his gaze felt suffocating. I tried to take my phone out of my bag, but my hands were shaking too much. My fingers fumbled, and when I finally managed to unlock it, I saw that the screen was covered in notifications. The first one was from my sister. She asked if I was okay and whether I'd gotten on the train safely. I quickly typed back, yes. But something is wrong. I'm not sure what's happening. But as I typed, I felt the air in the train car grow colder. I shivered, glancing up at the man again. He wasn't smiling anymore. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were now dark, almost black. I felt a chill run down my spine, as if the temperature in the car had dropped by several degrees in an instant. The train slowed, and the loud screech of the brakes broke through the eerie silence. It was the next stop, but something felt off. The doors didn't open immediately. The man didn't move, didn't react. He just stared. I stood up quickly, my breath quickening as I glanced at the doors. I was about to head for the exit when the man's voice, low and smooth, filled the space. "You don't want to get off here," he said, almost casually, as if we were just having a normal conversation. I froze. My legs felt heavy, as if they were rooted to the floor. The way he spoke, so sure, so calm, made my stomach turn. How could he possibly know what I wanted to do? How could he be so certain? "Just wait," he added, his voice still too soft, too calm. "You'll see." My pulse hammered in my chest as I backed away from the door, sitting down in the seat across from him once again. The train started moving again, its screeching sounds growing fainter with every passing second. "What do you want from me?" I blurted out, my voice shaking. I didn't care about hiding my fear anymore. He knew too much. I needed answers. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering my question. "I don't want anything," he said finally, his voice dropping lower. "I'm just here to make sure you follow the right path. You'll understand soon enough." His words were like a puzzle, each piece more confusing than the last. But there was something in his tone that sent a wave of dread over me. This wasn't a random encounter. This wasn't just some stranger trying to make conversation. This was something much darker, much more deliberate. I felt the air shift again, colder, heavier, almost suffocating. I looked out the window, but all I could see was a blur of dimly lit city streets. We were far from the busy parts of town now. The train seemed to be taking me deeper into a place I didn't recognize. Suddenly, my phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. This time, it wasn't a text. A new notification appeared on the screen, but it wasn't from anyone I knew. It was a simple message. Get off at the next stop. Do not look back. The blood drained from my face. I read the message again, my mind racing. Was this another of his games? I had to get off. I had to follow the instructions. But at the same time, every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay put, to not listen to him. The train continued down the tracks, its lights flickering intermittently. I couldn't help but look at him again. His eyes, those dark, empty eyes, were locked onto me. The corners of his mouth twitched upward, just slightly, as if waiting for me to make my move. I glanced at the exit. The next stop was coming up. The moment of truth. I had to decide. The train slowed again, but this time I didn't wait. I shot up from my seat, heart pounding, and rushed for the door. The air was thick with tension as I approached the exit, but just before the doors opened, I heard him speak once more. "You'll regret it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You'll regret everything." I ignored him. I couldn't stay on this train any longer. I stepped off as soon as the doors slid open, the cold night air hitting my face. But as soon as I stepped onto the platform, I looked around, and he was gone. He had vanished. Just like that. My breath caught in my throat. I scanned the empty platform. No one was there. I looked up and down the tracks, but there was nothing. It was as if he had never existed. I didn't know what to make of it. Was it a dream? A hallucination? No. It felt real. Too real. And the worst part was, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. That somehow, he was still watching me. I stood on the empty platform, feeling the weight of the silence close in around me. The cold air seemed to press against my skin, but it wasn't just the chill that made me feel trapped. It was the eerie sense that someone, was still there. Watching. Waiting. The train was long gone, the faint hum of its departure barely audible in the distance. The platform was deserted, yet every step I took felt heavier, as though the ground itself was reluctant to let me go. I didn't want to be here. I needed to get away. I checked my phone again, still expecting a message, but the screen was clear. Nothing. The strange notification had vanished, leaving no trace except for the creeping sense of dread that settled deep in my chest. My mind raced. I had to get out of here. This stop was nothing like any of the others. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally across the platform. I turned and began walking towards the exit, quickening my pace, but something tugged at the back of my mind. A feeling that I wasn't alone. As I reached the end of the platform, I heard it, faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. It was a voice. His voice. "Did you really think you could escape?" I froze mid-step. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, my blood running cold. I didn't turn around. I didn't dare. The voice had come from behind me, but I couldn't bring myself to look. I just kept walking, faster now, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever had been haunting me. I reached the stairs that led to the street level. There, standing at the top, was a figure. I couldn't make out the details at first, just a silhouette against the dim light of the street lamps. But then I saw it, his face. His eyes, dark and unblinking, staring right at me as if he had never left the train. I stumbled back, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear the sound of my breath. He was here. How? How could he be here? His lips curled into that same unsettling smile. You should have stayed on the train, he said, his voice echoing across the empty street. It was your only chance. I turned and ran. My footsteps echoed loudly in the quiet night, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct told me to run faster, to get as far away from him as possible. But no matter how quickly I moved, no matter how many turns I took through the darkened streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right behind me. His presence, invisible but unmistakable, followed me like a shadow. My phone buzzed again. Look behind you. I didn't hesitate. I turned around, my heart racing, but there was nothing. The street was empty. No one. No sign of him. I let out a shaky breath, confused and disoriented. Was I losing my mind? Was I imagining all of this? My phone rang suddenly, cutting through the fog of my thoughts. It was my sister. Hello? I answered breathlessly, trying to steady my voice. Where are you? What's going on? She asked, concern in her voice. You're scaring me. I can't reach you. Are you okay? I swallowed hard, still looking over my shoulder. I don't know, I whispered. I think I'm being followed. Something's wrong. I don't know how to explain it. There was a long pause on the other end. Then she spoke, her voice trembling. Listen to me carefully. Do not go home. Whatever you do, do not go home. I felt a cold shiver run through me. What? Why? I'm on my way, she said. Just don't go home. Trust me. I didn't wait for her to say anything else. I ended the call, my mind spinning. She was coming. But would she be able to stop whatever was happening? Would anyone be able to? I tried to find somewhere safe. A cafe, a convenience store, anything to hide in. But every place I approached felt more wrong than the last. The streets were empty, the buildings too quiet. I couldn't escape the feeling that the world around me was closing in, becoming smaller, darker, more suffocating with each passing second. And then, I heard it again, the faint sound of footsteps behind me. Not my own. Someone else's. I spun around, expecting to see him. But there was nothing. Only darkness. My phone buzzed again. This time, the message was simple. You're not alone anymore. I froze, feeling my heart drop into my stomach. How? How could he know? How was he doing this? Was this a game? A sick joke? I tried to shake the thoughts from my mind. But as the darkness pressed closer, I realized one thing. I was in deeper than I had ever imagined. And I had no idea how to escape. And worse still, I wasn't sure I even wanted to. The world had changed. It wasn't just him anymore. There was something else, something that followed me everywhere, that knew everything about me. And it wasn't going to let me go. Not ever. I ran again. But this time, I didn't know where I was running to. Only that I couldn't stop. Because if I did, I wasn't sure what would happen next. And that terrified me more than anything else. The streets blurred around me as I sprinted, my breath ragged in the cold night air. The world had become a maze, every corner a potential trap, every shadow a hidden threat. I had no clear destination, no safe place to hide. All I could think about was putting as much distance between myself and the presence that haunted me. The air seemed thicker now, oppressive, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Each alley I passed felt longer than the last, the distant hum of traffic more muffled, like the world outside had fallen silent, leaving me alone in this strange, suffocating bubble. And still, I could feel it, his gaze, his presence, like a constant weight pressing against my back. My phone buzzed again. Turn around. I didn't want to. I couldn't. But something compelled me. Slowly, I turned, my legs like lead, and there he was. The same man. Standing at the end of the street, just out of reach, his face barely visible in the dim glow of the streetlights. He wasn't moving, but I could feel him watching me, studying me. And I knew, deep down, that he was waiting for me to make a choice. I could run again, but I had no idea how much longer I could keep this up. Or I could face him, whatever that meant. I took a shaky step forward, then another. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, deafening in the silence around me. It was as though the world had shrunk to this one moment, this one choice. But as I moved closer, something changed. The air, thick and cold just moments ago, now felt electric, charged with an unnerving energy. A low hum began to rise from somewhere deep within the earth, vibrating through my feet, up my spine. I stopped, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The man's eyes, those dark, emotionless eyes, shifted, and for the first time, I saw something different in them. A flicker. Not of recognition, but of something darker. Suddenly, a loud crack pierced the air, like the sound of a distant explosion, followed by the unnatural stillness that followed. I didn't understand it at first. My mind couldn't process the impossibility of what I was seeing. The man was gone. No footsteps. No sound. Just nothing. I stood frozen, confused, looking around, but there was no sign of him. The street was empty. The cold, thick silence pressed in again, this time more suffocating than before. My phone buzzed in my hand once more. You shouldn't have come. My stomach churned. I looked down at the screen, my finger trembling as I read the words over and over, trying to make sense of them. The sensation of being watched hadn't disappeared. It was stronger now, more intense. The feeling that someone was just behind me, just beyond my line of sight, lingered. I turned, my breath shallow, my chest tight. But there was no one there. Only the shadows. Only the silence. Then, something caught my movement, a figure in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but no! It was him again, standing on the other side of the street, his back turned, as if waiting for me to come closer. I didn't hesitate. My feet carried me forward, without thought, without reason. The world felt distant now, my surroundings blurring into the background as I focused solely on him. The closer I got, the more the world around me seemed to distort, like the edges of reality were bending, stretching. The streetlights flickered, their light wavering, casting long, twisted shadows across the sidewalk. And then, just as I was about to call out to him, something shifted again. The sound of footsteps. But they weren't mine. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one behind me. The streets were empty. I looked back at the figure. He was closer now, almost at arm's reach. His expression was blank, his eyes voids of darkness, unblinking, unfeeling. "You didn't listen," he whispered. His voice was low, distorted, like it was coming from inside my head. "And now you've crossed the line." I froze. My pulse thundered in my ears. What line? What did he mean? Before I could react, he stepped toward me, his figure growing larger, his form shifting in the dim light, becoming something more unsettling. The world around me warped, the air thick with a strange pressure, as if the very fabric of reality was being pulled taut. I reached for my phone, desperate to find some way out of this nightmare, but the screen was blank. Completely blank. It was as if the device itself had ceased to exist. My breath caught in my throat. "Now you'll know what it's like," he said, his voice now cold, final. And in that moment, I realized the truth. This man, this presence, he wasn't just following me. He was a part of me, a reflection of the choices I had made. I turned and ran, as fast as I could, but the street stretched out endlessly in front of me, the shadows lengthening, the hum in the air growing louder. I wasn't running to escape anymore. I was running for myself. But no matter how fast I ran, I knew it was only a matter of time before I was caught. And when that time came, the world would never be the same again. The end, or is it? Have you ever experienced a moment when something so small and seemingly insignificant suddenly sends your heart racing? It's strange how the most ordinary things can turn into sources of dread when the world feels just slightly off. That's exactly how it started for me, one small, strange moment that grew into something far bigger. I had just come back home after a long day. The kind of day that drags you down, the weight of mundane tasks slowly crushing you, leaving you with nothing but exhaustion. I didn't even bother turning on the lights as I entered the bathroom. The overhead light flickered briefly before steadying. The soft hum of the air vent was the only sound, the comforting white noise that comes with being alone in your own home. I closed the door behind me and moved toward the sink. As I splashed cold water on my face, I couldn't help but feel the familiar weight of the silence pressing down on me. It was peaceful, really. Just the quiet of my apartment, the emptiness. My reflection in the mirror was blurry, partially obscured by the steam rising from the warm water. But as I wiped my face dry with a towel, something caught my eye. A message. At first, I thought I was imagining it. My mind playing tricks on me, surely. But as I leaned closer to the mirror, my heart sank. The foggy glass had a single phrase written in it. "Don't turn around." My stomach dropped. My first instinct was to laugh it off. A joke, maybe? But there was no one else in the apartment. I had been alone all evening. No one had entered while I was in the bathroom. I stared at the message, unable to make sense of it. How could it be there? The condensation from the shower was thick, but it hadn't been there before. I had seen the mirror clear only a few seconds ago. I took a deep breath, trying to push down the unease creeping up my spine. I wiped the mirror again, expecting the message to disappear with the steam. But it didn't. It was still there, as if it had been etched into the very surface of the glass. I leaned in even closer, the message growing more ominous in the low light. "Don't turn around." I turned quickly, my heart racing. The bathroom behind me was empty, the same as when I had walked in. The space felt no different. My reflection in the mirror, however, seemed strange, distorted. The light flickered again, casting shadows that stretched unnaturally along the walls. Nothing was there. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood still for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe it was just my mind. The stress of the day, the exhaustion playing tricks. Maybe I had missed something, or maybe the fog had made the message appear out of nowhere. I tried to convince myself of that, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread settling over me like a heavy blanket. I should have just left the bathroom then. I should have just walked out. But something stopped me. Some part of me wanted to understand. I needed to know who had written it, and more importantly, why. The air around me felt colder now, even though the heat in the apartment was on. It was an unnatural chill. The kind that seeps into your bones, the kind that tells you something is wrong. I stood there for a moment longer, the silence pressing down on me like a vice. That's when I heard it. A soft tap on the bathroom door. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. No one had been in the apartment, I was sure of it. I hadn't heard anyone come in. But there it was again, a tap, faint but distinct. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I couldn't breathe. My eyes were locked on the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing came. I slowly reached for the doorknob, my hand shaking. The room seemed to get colder still. Every noise felt magnified, my breathing, the sound of my pulse in my ears, the soft, steady hum of the air vent. It all seemed too loud now. Too real. I turned the doorknob, slowly, and opened the door, half expecting to find someone standing on the other side. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I stepped out cautiously, my mind racing, every part of me screaming that something wasn't right. My fingers lingered on the doorframe, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow in the hallway. Nothing. It was like nothing had changed, but everything had. I felt different. The atmosphere was thicker now, more oppressive. The same apartment I'd lived in for months now seemed foreign, alien. I looked back at the bathroom, the door still ajar. The mirror was visible through the crack, clear now. No message. Maybe it had been my imagination. Maybe the fog, the exhaustion, it had all combined to make me see things that weren't there. But deep down, I knew something was off. And I knew I hadn't imagined the message. I didn't sleep that night. The following day felt normal. The sun was shining, birds were chirping outside my window. It should have been a perfect day. But the strange events from the night before lingered, like a dark cloud hanging over me, one I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. I tried to move on. I forced myself to ignore the creeping feeling that had settled in my chest. The day passed slowly, filled with distractions, work, errands, small talk with friends. I told myself it was all in my head. That night, though, the anxiety returned. I couldn't help it. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I walked through my apartment, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, watching me. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside my window made me jump. It was as if the world had shifted, as if nothing was quite right anymore. As I prepared for bed, the image of that message, "Don't turn around," kept playing in my mind. I couldn't forget it, no matter how much I wanted to. I kept imagining someone writing it there, someone who had been in my apartment while I was distracted. But that thought didn't make sense. I'd been alone. No one had been with me. My eyes kept drifting toward the bathroom door, half open in the hallway. It looked so innocent in the dim light, yet the memory of the message made it feel like a forbidden space. The shadows seemed to shift as the light flickered. I shook my head. I needed to stop overthinking. But as I climbed into bed, I couldn't ignore the cold, the deep chill that had returned. It wasn't just the temperature of the room, it was something more. Something wrong. A feeling of being watched. I pulled the covers tighter around me, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. I must have dozed off, but the feeling never left. Then, around 2 in the morning, I woke with a start. I wasn't sure what had roused me, but the air was heavy. The apartment was eerily still, and for a split second, I felt as though I were not alone. My heart raced in my chest. I held my breath, straining to listen. The silence was oppressive, yet I felt the tension. Something wasn't right. Something was out of place. My eyes darted to the hallway, where the bathroom door stood slightly ajar. The faint glow of the moonlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows that stretched along the floor. It wasn't the shadows that made my stomach tighten. It was the sound. A soft tap. It came from the direction of the bathroom. I froze, my body going rigid. The tap wasn't like the one I had heard before. This was different. This one was closer, more deliberate. A slow, methodical tap, like someone's fingers gently tapping on the door. I stared at the hallway, willing myself to breathe. But I couldn't. My chest felt tight, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to look. But I had to. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet hitting the cold floor. The tapping stopped. A thick, suffocating silence settled over me. I didn't know what to do. My body was trembling, yet I was rooted to the spot. It could be nothing, I told myself. The wind. A creak from the building. It was probably nothing. But the thought of checking, of walking down that hallway toward the bathroom, made my skin crawl. What if it wasn't nothing? What if I wasn't alone? I took a deep breath and stood up, my legs shaky beneath me. Every step I took seemed to echo in the stillness, a loud sound in the otherwise quiet apartment. As I reached the door, I glanced back at my bedroom. Nothing seemed out of place. Yet, every inch of my being screamed at me to turn around, to run back to the safety of my bed and forget this madness. But I couldn't. I had to know. I slowly reached for the bathroom door. The cold handle sent a jolt through my body, but I gripped it tightly. I hesitated for only a second before I pushed the door open. Nothing. The bathroom was empty, just as it should be. The light flickered again, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. The mirror, as I expected, was clear, no messages, no words written in fog. Relief washed over me. I had to be imagining things, right? This was just fear playing tricks on me. But then, I saw it. In the corner of the mirror, where the light barely touched, I noticed something faint. Something I hadn't seen before. A shadow. At first, I thought it was just the way the light reflected. But as I stared, it moved. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a figure, barely discernible in the darkness. A figure that seemed to be watching me. My heart skipped a beat. I stumbled backward, nearly falling, my eyes never leaving the figure in the mirror. The figure didn't move, not really. It just stood there, still as stone, its shape growing clearer the longer I stared at it. I couldn't look away. I couldn't move. Then, In the faintest whisper, I heard it. A voice, soft, barely audible, saying only one thing. I told you not to turn around. I didn't stay to hear anything else. I ran. I ran back to my room, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My breathing was shallow, panicked, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I tried to call someone, anyone, but my phone wouldn't work. The screen remained black, unresponsive. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I just lay there, staring at the door, listening to the silence that felt so loud, waiting for the next thing to happen. The message had come true, and I was no longer alone. The morning light was no comfort. In fact, it only made things worse. The soft rays of sunlight creeping through the blinds felt like a cruel contrast to the fear still gripping me. I was awake, but I wasn't really alive. I didn't go to work. I couldn't. I was too shaken, too unsettled. What was happening to me? I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. After all, I had been under a lot of stress lately. Work, relationships, the constant pressure to keep everything together. But deep down, I knew that couldn't be the whole story. I had seen that figure in the mirror. I had heard that voice. The eerie part? It didn't just stay in the bathroom. As the day went on, I found myself hearing whispers. Soft, barely noticeable sounds that came from nowhere. The wind, maybe? Or the hum of the refrigerator? No. These whispers were different, more deliberate, as if someone was speaking directly to me. They would stop when I turned to listen, then start again when I looked away. It was like being haunted by something unseen. I checked the bathroom again. The mirror was clear, nothing out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one there. Later that evening, I decided to go out, desperate to get away from the house. I needed to clear my mind. I went for a walk, hoping the fresh air would help me think straight. But as I strolled down the street, I noticed something odd. There was a man watching me. He was standing under a streetlight across the road, his face obscured by the shadows. But there was something about him, something familiar. My heart raced. I couldn't place it, but I knew him. No, I didn't know him, but it felt like I did. I quickened my pace, my eyes never leaving him. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. I glanced away for a moment, trying to ignore the rising panic in my chest. When I looked back, he was gone. Just like that. Vanished into thin air. Shaken, I hurried back to my apartment, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. What was happening to me? Was it the same man from the mirror? Had he followed me outside? I didn't know what to think, but I knew one thing for sure. I was being watched. I locked the door behind me and retreated to my living room, sitting on the couch with my thoughts swirling around me. It was then that I noticed something odd. My phone had a notification. I hadn't seen it earlier, and I couldn't recall hearing it buzz. I opened the message. It was from an unknown number. I see you. My blood ran cold. There was no name, no indication of who had sent it. I tried calling the number, but it went straight to voicemail. I felt a wave of dread wash over me. This wasn't just a coincidence anymore. Someone was playing a game, and I didn't know the rules. I spent the rest of the evening locked inside, pacing between the rooms, convinced I was being followed, watched, or worse, hunted. Every sound in the building, The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the streetlights outside sent my heart into a frantic race. That night, I fell into a restless sleep. It was filled with distorted dreams, shadows chasing me, voices whispering my name. But when I woke up, something was different. Something was off. I walked to the bathroom, instinctively checking the mirror. And there it was again. On the glass, in the same handwriting as before, "Don't run. You can't escape." I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands trembled as I reached out to wipe the condensation away, but the message didn't disappear. It stayed there, staring back at me, as if mocking my every attempt to make sense of it. I couldn't breathe. It was like the walls were closing in around me. I turned to leave, but then I heard it, a sound coming from behind me. Slow, deliberate footsteps dragging against the floor. My body froze. I couldn't move. I turned around, slowly. The bathroom door was closed. There was no one there. But the footsteps, the unmistakable sound of someone walking toward me, getting closer. It was so real. So vivid. And then, without warning, I felt a hand on my shoulder. A cold, clammy hand. I gasped, spinning around to face it, but there was nothing there. No one. The silence returned, more oppressive than before. My heart hammered in my chest as I backed away, stumbling over my own feet. The walls felt like they were closing in. I couldn't escape. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my phone again, desperate to call for help, but before I could, I saw it. The text message. "I'm right behind you." I turned around, expecting to see something. But there was nothing. Except the cold, empty bathroom. And the oppressive feeling that something was watching me. Waiting. The question burned in my mind. Who or what was doing this to me? And why? The answers, it seemed, were just out of reach. For now. I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. It wasn't just the messages or the footsteps. It was the feeling that something was always lurking just behind me, watching, waiting for the right moment to make its move. The weight of it pressed on my chest, suffocating me with every breath I took. I grabbed my keys and left, my mind racing with possibilities. Where could I go? What could I do? The rational part of me knew this was ridiculous, that there had to be an explanation. But the fear was stronger than logic, and it pushed me toward anything that could offer a sense of safety. I drove aimlessly, the streets empty under the dim glow of the streetlights. My thoughts swirled in a chaotic mess. Was someone out to get me? Had I angered someone unknowingly? Or was it something worse? Something beyond explanation? I stopped at a park, thinking the open space might calm my nerves. The park was deserted, eerily quiet except for the distant hum of traffic. I sat on a bench, trying to steady my breathing, but the sense of unease wouldn't leave me. Then I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. I froze. It was impossible. There was no one around. I stood up quickly, scanning the shadows. The footsteps were faint at first, as if someone was just outside my line of sight. But they were getting closer. And closer. I spun around, but again, no one. The path was empty. It was just your mind, I told myself. You're exhausted. You're imagining things. But then I saw it. In the dim light, by the edge of the park, a figure appeared. Tall, thin, and oddly still. It was a man, but his face was obscured by the shadows. He stood there, motionless, staring directly at me. His presence felt wrong, like he didn't belong. I couldn't move. My feet felt frozen to the ground, my body unwilling to take another step. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, watching me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I tried to call out, but no words came. The air felt thick, suffocating. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. And just as suddenly as he appeared, the figure stepped back into the darkness. Gone. I blinked, and the park was once again empty. No trace of the man remained, as if he had never been there at all. My body trembled. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface erupted, flooding my veins. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay anywhere. I rushed back to my car, hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I had to go home. I had to figure out what was happening. What was this? Who was following me? I drove back to my apartment, though every corner of the city seemed to feel like it was closing in on me. The streets, the buildings, the very air, they all felt suffocating. When I finally reached my door, I almost expected to find something waiting for me. But nothing. I hesitated before unlocking it. A fleeting thought crossed my mind. What if this is it? What if I walk in and I'm not alone? I shook my head, trying to push away the dread. I wasn't going to let fear control me. I took a deep breath and entered the apartment, checking the rooms quickly. Empty. As it should be. But something was off. The atmosphere was different, thicker, as if it had changed in my absence. And then I saw it. The mirror. It was fogged up again, the same way it had been when the message first appeared. My heart skipped a beat, but I couldn't stop myself from walking toward it. The same feeling that had gripped me in the bathroom came rushing back, but this time it was accompanied by a cold sense of dread. Something was there. Something I couldn't explain. I reached out to wipe the fog away, expecting to see my reflection. But as the mist cleared, I saw something else. A message. A new one. You can never escape. It was written in the same handwriting. The same threatening tone. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, a wave of panic crashing over me. There was no way. I had been alone. No one else had been in the apartment. I stared at the message, trying to process it, but all I could hear was the deafening sound of my own heartbeat. Then, as if on cue, the footsteps returned. Closer this time. Not from the hallway, not from outside the apartment, but from within the room. Soft, measured steps, coming toward me. I turned slowly, my body trembling uncontrollably. There, standing in the doorway, was the same figure from the park. He was closer now, his face still hidden in shadow. But I could feel his eyes on me. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot. The figure took another step forward, and this time I could hear his voice. You're not alone. You've never been alone. The words cut through the air, cold and chilling. And as he stepped into the light, his face finally came into view. It was me. My own reflection stared back at me, grinning in a way I could never have imagined. My heart stopped. The reflection in the mirror wasn't me. It was something else. Something twisted, a dark version of myself. and it was smiling. The message had been clear. I wasn't just being watched. I was being replaced. And the worst part? I was starting to believe it. The room spun around me as I tried to process what I was seeing. My reflection, no, it smiled wider, its lips curving in an unnatural way. The darkness around it deepened, making the figure seem even more detached from reality. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. My breath quickened, shallow gasps filling the silence. The reflection didn't move, its cold, eerie grin widening with every second that passed. "You're not real," I whispered to myself, trying to hold on to some shred of sanity. The reflection didn't reply, but I could feel it. The air grew heavier, the room pressing in around me. Every sound was amplified, my own breathing, the pounding of my heart, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. And then, the silence, the footsteps, too close, too real. They were moving behind me. I spun around, expecting to see the figure from the park, but no one was there. I turned back to the mirror, and for a split second, the twisted version of me blinked. The room around me felt colder now, the shadows deeper, as if the space itself had been stretched thin. I looked back at my reflection. It wasn't smiling anymore, it was watching me, its eyes filled with malice. And then, without warning, the figure raised a hand, mirroring mine exactly. I raised my hand instinctively, and it did the same, but the reflection, it didn't just mimic me. It reached out from the glass. My pulse raced. I jerked my hand back, but the figure didn't let go. I could feel its cold fingers brushing against mine through the mirror. What is happening? The reflection's hand stayed there, suspended in the air, as if waiting for something. It was as if the barrier between the world and the glass was starting to thin, and I was no longer sure where I ended and the thing in the mirror began. I felt my legs weaken beneath me. The thing in the mirror was growing bolder. Its fingers twitched, almost like it was trying to reach through, to take me, to pull me into the dark emptiness beyond the glass. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, panic bursts. My mind was racing, trying to find any logical explanation for what I was seeing, but the more I looked, the more I was convinced that none existed. A deep, low laugh echoed from somewhere behind me. It was distant, distorted, like it was coming from within the very walls themselves. I spun around again, expecting something, anything, but there was nothing. The apartment was still empty. I was still alone. Or was I? I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, staring at me. And then it spoke. "You don't belong here anymore," it said, its voice a distorted echo of my own. I staggered back, my mind reeling. "What do you want from me?" It didn't answer. Instead, the figure stepped forward. Slowly, methodically. Its hand still hovered over the glass, but it was getting closer. The glass trembled, the surface rippling like water. The reflection's eyes never left mine, its grin growing even wider. "You're already too far gone," it whispered. I tried to run. My legs refused to obey. The apartment was suddenly too small, suffocating me with its silence and the suffocating presence of the thing in the mirror. My body was shaking uncontrollably as I tried to escape, but the walls felt like they were closing in, pressing against me from all sides. I ran for the door, hands scrambling for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as if the apartment itself was rejecting me. A scream caught in my throat, but no sound came. I was locked inside with it, and the room felt colder with every passing second. I turned back toward the mirror. The figure was closer now, so close, in fact, that I could see the details of its twisted features. Its face, my face, was distorted, stretched beyond recognition, and its eyes were now wide, unblinking, staring into mine. And then I understood. It wasn't just watching me. It was becoming me. I backed away from the mirror, but its reflection followed every move I made. I could no longer tell if I was looking at myself or at something that was already taking my place. The figure in the mirror grinned one final time, a malicious, triumphant smile. I reached for the door again, this time forcing it open with every ounce of strength I had left. My heart raced as I ran into the hallway, away from the apartment, away from the mirror, but I could feel it, the pull. The weight of the reflection's gaze still on me. I don't know how long I ran for. Minutes? Hours? The world outside the apartment was a blur, a cacophony of noise and shadows. I found myself in the street, trembling, gasping for breath, but I couldn't escape the feeling that the thing in the mirror was still there, following me, watching me from behind the glass. The city seemed empty, quieter than usual, but I couldn't shake the sense that it wasn't just the mirror that was watching. The world itself was. The reflection hadn't just stayed in the apartment. It had followed me. And wherever I went, it would be there, waiting for me to finally accept my place in its world. I was no longer certain if I was the real one, or if the one in the mirror had already taken my place. And that, more than anything else, terrified me. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.